It's June 1950. Korea is a divided land. After World War II, Korea was split at the 38th parallel, with South Korea backed by the United States and North Korea Soviet-aligned. Tensions simmer, but no one expects what comes next. On June 25th, North Korean forces storm across the border. Seoul falls in days. The Cold War ignites. The United Nations, led by the United States, condemns the invasion, forming a coalition to save South Korea. President Truman taps General Douglas MacArthur, hero of 2 world wars, now leading Japan's occupation, to command the UN forces. But the situation is grim. South Korean and United Nations troops are cornered at Pusan, fighting to survive. Conventional wisdom would have MacArthur reinforce his forces there and then try to break out. Instead, he bets on a daring plan, an amphibious landing at Incheon, deep behind enemy lines. It's a treacherous target. Tides and terrains make it a gamble. Planners also doubt it. MacArthur himself calls it 5,000 to 1 odds. Yet, he gets the go-ahead. On September 15, 1950, South Korea's freedom hangs in the balance. But MacArthur believes a bold strike at Incheon could turn the tide and forge a legacy of liberty that will endure.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, General Curtis Scaparrotti, General Vincent Brooks, General Paul LaCamera, Lieutenant General Bill Burleson. Thank you for being here today. My name is Amanda Williams, and I am the director of the MacArthur Memorial, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to Risking It All, the Incheon Landings at 75 and the legacy of the Korean War. This event is a partnership between the City of Norfolk's MacArthur Memorial, the Korea Defense Veterans Association, and the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation. And I speak for the memorial when I say we are incredibly grateful to be able to stand alongside such extraordinary partners. 75 years ago, this September, General Douglas MacArthur, the first United Nations Command Commander, defied the odds with one of history's boldest amphibious operations at Incheon. Always a proponent of decisive action, MacArthur accepted the risks at Incheon and later noted that the people of the Republic of Korea were also risking it all to preserve their sovereignty and democracy. His boldness at Incheon, the sacrifices of those under his command, and the resilience of the Korean people continue to shape our world today. Ironically, though, the Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War, and it absolutely should not be. With our partners today, we are committed to preserving and presenting the history of the Korean War, to understanding its continued resonance, and to recognizing those that served in the war. Today, we are particularly honored to have a Korean War veteran with us. Lance Corporal Daniel Nuzzo, a United States Marine, served in Korea from 1952 to 1953. Please join me in welcoming him and his family here today. Thank you, sir, for being here with us. Are there any other Korean War veterans with us today? Any who have served in Korea? Thank you all for being here today, too. Now, please join me in welcoming a great friend of the MacArthur Memorial, Colonel Steve Lee, Senior Vice President of Operations for the Korea Defense Veterans Association.
So, thank you, Amanda, and your team at the MacArthur Memorial. Korea Defense Veterans Association is very thankful to work with you and on this very historic and unique event. On behalf of the current President and Chairman, General Robert Abrams, he is currently on his way to Incheon to participate in the 75th anniversary events there on Monday. So he sends his regards and he welcomes you on behalf of KDVA. So we're very proud of our partnership with the MacArthur Memorial. We are one of 39 partners in 4 countries on 4 continents, all with the very simple purpose of supporting Korea and our veterans. So let me throw some numbers at you. There are 1.8 million Korean War veterans like General MacArthur and Mr. Denizo, and 3.3 million Korea defense veterans like all our panelists, the former UNC commanders. And KDVA exists only to support their work and what they have done for both countries. We do that by raising awareness at events like this forum, local chapters in Korea and in 7 U.S. chapters around the country, scholarships, KDVA campus clubs, internship programs, and the Museum Translation Project. For those of you that don't know, there's a special section here that's dedicated to General MacArthur's time in Korea. And KDVA has translated all of that English into Korean. You just got to go and scan the QR code and it'll pop up in Korean on your phones. And we're very thankful to have been able to do that with the MacArthur Memorial. And then we have our annual KDVA reunion in San Diego in October 24th through 25th. Everything that KDVA does is free. Unbelievable as it is, everything is free because we have a great fundraising partner in Korea called the Korea-U.S. Alliance Foundation. So even our membership is free, and it's open to literally everyone in this room. So if you care about Korea and veterans, you can join for free. It only takes you a couple of minutes. So please consider joining. 52,000 KDVA current members and over 120,000 social media followers. And we've set record growth for the past 4 years, and we're on a pace to do another one this year. Again, the importance of that is to continue to raise awareness among Americans and Koreans about the important work that Korean War veterans like General MacArthur and our former commanders, Korea defense veterans, have done. So again, thank you for being here. Hope you have some good questions for all of our panelists, and hope you're ready to engage. So thank you. Amanda.
Thank you, Colonel. This afternoon, we also have a very special statement to share from Arthur MacArthur IV, the son of General Douglas MacArthur. And please join me now in welcoming Gary Bonnewell, chairman of the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation, to share this historic statement.
I'm going to read you the letter that he has written to us. Korea holds a special place in the hearts of both my grandfather, Lieutenant General Arthur MacArthur, and my father, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. They both visited Incheon together in the winter of 1905 when my grandfather was the general and his son, a young lieutenant in the United States Army. 45 years later, my father would return to Incheon as general engaged in a desperate campaign for the defense of South Korea. Communist forces were close to destroying the dream of South Korea, but Incheon proved to key to wresting victory from the jaws of defeat. Few believed in the prospect of victory in September 1950. Victory at Incheon was given 5,000 to 1 odds of working, but my father brought together the best minds to ensure victory. Almost overnight, the multinational invasion force was assembled, while the courage of South Korean guerrillas and intelligence operatives laid the groundwork for success. As my father predicted, communist forces were caught completely by surprise. Within weeks, Seoul was free again and the South Korean government was restored. The result of Incheon was the freedom of South Korea and 75 years of prosperity for its people. As my father said in 1951, of the nations in the world, Korea alone, up to now, is the sole one which has risked it all against communism. The magnificence of the courage and fortitude of the Korean people defies description. They have chosen to risk death rather than slavery. Your country, Korea, is the beacon of all free peoples of the world. May you know only perpetual peace and prosperity. God bless you on your commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the invasion of Incheon, respectively, Arthur MacArthur.
In part one of our program, we are going to hear from two distinguished speakers with a brief Q&A following each period if time permits. Our first speaker is Dr. Bruce Bennett. Dr. Bennett is a senior international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. He is an expert on Northeast Asian security issues, having visited the region some 130 times and written much about Korean security. His research addresses issues such as North Korean military threats, countering the North Korean nuclear threat and provocations, future Republic of Korea military force requirements, Korean unification, and Korean military balance, and potential Chinese military intervention in North Korea. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bennett.
Thank you for that warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here today. As you might tell from that introduction, I'm not a history professor of Korean history. I work on Korean national security, present generation. But you can't do that without knowing about the history. The history is critical. I'm not going to try and dwell on all of the details of the history. The reality is there's a lot of things we still don't know, and there's a lot of contradictory information. For example, in 1950, June, when the invasion occurred, how many U.S. troops were in Korea? Well, some records say 200, other records say 300, and some even say 500. And we don't really know. But as soon as you listen to those numbers, you know that the North Korean story that South Korea and the United States invaded North Korea is utter nonsense. We would never invade the North when we have less than 500 troops in South Korea. And so there are many differences, and there are many places where we would like to have more information. Chinese records, North Korean records. I'm going to put all of that aside because we don't have them. I'm going to focus on some of the U.S. Army historical records and others as I proceed. So let me get started here. World War II ends. We've had this huge military, and we've taken severe penalties as a country. A lot of Americans were really anxious to get back to peace, to get over the casualties, to get over the economic impacts that so severely limited people, and to get over other problems. We really wanted to have our soldiers come home. And so there was a very rapid demobilization. So we started in 1945 with a military of some 12 million soldiers, all services, with the numbers indicated there, very large forces. Soon those numbers were significantly smaller. There was a rapid demobilization. That was important because that's what the country wanted. In addition, by 1950, we had a military of about 1.5 million. Now that's about 10% more than where we are today, but for a population that was less than half the size of our current population. So it was a pretty big military. The question, of course, was, Had we prepared it for future situations? The answer is, well, really no. President Truman wanted a peace dividend. He wanted to severely reduce the defense budget and put it to other uses. And so you can see the drawdown in defense budget. This is in real world, in terms of the Army divisions. We went from over 90 divisions to some 10 divisions. It's not a lot of force. We have 10 divisions today. The problem was they weren't funded very well. And so what you see here is a statement from the U.S. Army that they weren't well trained, they weren't well prepared. There just wasn't the resources put into it. What about our principal opponent? Well, the Soviet ground forces also shrank after World War II, but not nearly as much. They maintained large forces in Europe that focused our attention on Europe, and we were very concerned that sooner or later the Soviets would cross from East Germany and Czechoslovakia into West Germany, into France, and so forth. So the Soviet imperialistic attitude, wanting to control the countries, taking over all of Eastern Europe after the war, that became a major concern that led to the formation of NATO, but also a major focus of U.S. attention there. So how did it happen? Well, you can look over the years there, an incredible takeover of countries as time went on and the Soviets advanced. They didn't just advance in many cases, they took the countries over, the governments. Some places where they didn't, it wasn't too long before they did. And you see this pattern. There was a real concern on the U.S. side that we had to be prepared to counter that and to take other action to get it under control. And so there was a major focus on the European situation, discussion of what was called the domino theory, that if the Soviets got control in some place, they were going to spread out in other places and adjoining and take control of those places as well. It's discussed by President Truman when he tries to fund activities in Greece and Turkey because the communists were working there to overthrow the governments. And even President Eisenhower makes a big deal about it. So where are we? Well, this led to hopes of peace being kind of dashed. We were concerned that the world was now in a Cold War. And so President Truman wanted to focus on containing the Soviet advance. He wanted the U.S. to support our allies, to support other countries so there would not be this communist domination. And he does this economically. Help to Greece and Turkey, then the Marshall Plan to help all of the countries in Europe, major investment. Just one problem. There's not a major investment in the U.S. military. In fact, he's looking for the peace dividend to help pay for the Marshall Plan and other activities. With that in mind, give you an idea of the budget. These are in real $2,000 terms, so inflation is washed out. This is what the real dollar expenditure was on defenses. The green line being total defense, but the concern here being the red and the purple line. Those are showing you how much money was being spent on acquiring military equipment and on research and development for military equipment. We go to the Korean War, you get to Task Force Smith that I'll talk about in a minute, and they're using old weapons to try and take down Soviet tanks that are now in North Korean possession, and they're just not up to it because we're kind of focused on 1945 equipment. We just haven't been buying a lot. Just by basis of comparison, In the year 2000, the green star over there was how much we were spending on defense. Double what was spending in real terms, inflation washed out, of what was being spent in the 1950-51 time frame. And much more than that in terms of equipment acquisition. You just can't maintain a military and have it ready if you don't cover those issues. So the question was, of course, was the U.S. protecting Korea? In January of 1950, the U.S. Secretary of State Acheson made a major speech, and he defined the U.S. defensive perimeter as from the Aleutians to Japan to essentially Okayama and then down to the Philippines. And that didn't include South Korea. Now, the problem there was, of course, North Korea heard that, the Soviets heard that, and they started wondering if they could get away with it, to actually do an invasion. Many scholars believe that this encouraged North Korea, and it wasn't as if North Korea was coming to this for the first time. Kim Il-sung had control of the North Korean government from the late 1940s. He'd been pressing Stalin to invade the South, but the Chinese forces were still involved in the Civil War. American forces were still occupying South Korea. In 1948, we had 20,000 troops in South Korea. There's no way North Korea could invade and not have a major war with the US. So Stalin tells Kim Il-sung, back off. It's just not a good time to do this. So what happens? Well, the US withdrew our 20,000 occupation forces. In 1949, Stalin finally approves Kim's request to invade the South, and he even sends experienced Soviet generals to assist in planning the invasion of South Korea. What did we have in terms of forces in South Korea? Well, I noted we had very few American troops there. Why were they there? They were there training the South Koreans in peacekeeping and in peace enforcement. North Korean troops were in South Korea. They were in there with insurgents. There was considerable fighting in the rear area of South Korea. In fact, roughly half of the South Korean army forces were dealing with counterinsurgency deep in the South and not up on the border. So you had limited. The US, though, knew that the South Korean president did want to take control of all Korea. He did want to invade the North, so we provided no tanks to the South Korean military. We provided very little artillery and shorter range artillery at that, so that he was not encouraged in that thinking. That left a difficult problem because the North Korean forces were quite different. Many of the North Korean forces had been fighting in the Chinese Civil War. They were combat veterans. They knew what they were doing in warfare. They came back after the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949 to North Korea, were organized. They had Soviet tanks that were pretty good tanks for that time, and they had an air force that could do combat activity. South Koreans did not. So what happened from there? Well, the North Koreans invade in June 25, 1950. They invade into the South. No question, it's a North Korean invasion, not a South Korean invasion of the North. 10 divisions crossing the border against a smaller South Korean force and a poorly trained South Korean force for major combat. They advance rapidly. They use the tanks in particular in the parts of the terrain where it's feasible to do that, to push ahead. The US tries to stop them. We send initial battalion of forces to the area of Osan, Task Force Smith, and they go in to try to stop the North Korean tank movements, but they don't have the equipment to do it. And so they get blown through relatively quickly. It was a difficult situation. You can see from the advance lines over on the map there, the North Korean forces moved quite rapidly down to the Pusan perimeter, where finally, with major reinforcements from U.S. forces in Japan, there was a perimeter that was maintained by a combined U.S. forces, South Korean forces, and forces from other allies who were by then supporting us. Where did the other allies come from? Well, the U.S. went to the UN. The UN was supposed to try to prevent these failures of peace and to maintain peace throughout the world. We went to the UN Security Council and asked to organize a UN command. Now you might think, well, you can't do that today because the Russians and the Chinese will oppose it and prevent it from happening. Fortunately, the Chinese weren't in that position at this point, and the Soviets were not participating in the Security Council. They had decided to not participate, and so the U.S. was able to get Security Council support for a UN command to be created. There were several actions taken the day of the invasion. The Security Council condemned the attack. 2 days later, they asked other countries to support South Korea, and a little over a week, and they are authorizing the UN command. The U.S. sent ground forces from Japan to South Korea. We also prepared other ground forces that MacArthur then uses for the Incheon Landing. So, what happens with the Incheon Landing? Well, the perimeter around Pusan was a very difficult place to fight. Not exactly where there was an advantage for the U.S. and our allies. But the invasion in Incheon put a real stress. Just to get down to Pusan, the North Koreans had exceeded their supply line capabilities. They were stretched then and having trouble maintaining capabilities. In addition, they were having trouble maintaining forces throughout the rest of South Korea to occupy it. And so the landing, which hits a soft point in some ways, way up in the north, just causes a fracture of the North Korean forces. And as you can see from the blue lines here shown, gradually, not too gradually, they get pushed back so that within a short period of time, well, the U.S. and South Korean forces are well north, even above what is now the demilitarized zone. And we keep going. Problem is, as we get close to the Chinese border, the Chinese forces intervene. This was, of course, a theoretical Chinese People's Volunteer Army, as in you volunteer when you're told to volunteer. They sent a large force into North Korea. They pushed the forces back. Our Marine colleagues who were defending up in the northeast of North Korea had a miserable experience in that area. It was very difficult. But throughout North Korea, they got pushed back. Eventually, the Chinese capture Seoul in April of 1951, but then the UN command drives them back out by May. From that point on, battle is continuing back and forth in the area around the 38th parallel, where the original border had been, and that continued until 1953 when there was an armistice. Okay, so what do we conclude from all of this? Kim Il-sung hoped that he could capture South Korea and control it, that he would own all of Korea. He wanted to be in control of the country. Didn't happen. Now, there was supposed to be elections in South Korea, but North Korea never allowed those to occur with North Korea. The Korean people were supposed to choose a combined government. The North would never allow those elections to occur. Kim hoped he could take control. Didn't happen. Fundamentally, Incheon was key to pushing the North Koreans back. And had they not had the Chinese intervention, well, there would be a unified Korea today, but it wouldn't be a North Korean unified. The Chinese were able to withhold UN command, but we were able to withhold the Chinese as well and eventually had to accept an armistice. This showed that the domino theory wasn't necessarily right. A lot of people had worried that the communist world was gradually going to take over, and we held in Korea. That was really fundamental to the spirit of the people in the free world, that the communist advance could be stopped. And that is a critical event. The other key thing is there was a potential that nuclear weapons would get used in 1950. You know, the US said as early as the late 40s that we just weren't going to allow military actions by the Soviets or their proxies. And if they did it, we would use nuclear weapons to stop it. Well, there were a lot of reasons why nuclear weapons weren't used in 1950. Probably a good thing that they weren't. And so that was a good part of history to avoid that. But it meant that that part of deterrence also disappeared in subsequent years. And then you see other gradual communist activities in other places like Vietnam. Nuclear weapons is my specialty. Now, September, this month, is my 50th anniversary at RAND. When I started at RAND, I was assigned to work strategic nuclear issues. So I'm in my 50th year now. That's what I spend a lot of my time. That's the classes that I teach in our graduate school. And I'm sure some of you may be interested in that kind of thing, which I would be happy to discuss during the reception. But for now, my speech is about the Incheon Landing. I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bennett. We have about 8 minutes for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please wait for the microphone. It's traveling around.
Good afternoon, sir, and thank you for that very informative presentation. It was awesome. How many nukes did the U.S. actually have in 1950 that could have been used, or was that just like a bluff?
Let me tell you, I've spent a lot of time in the National Archives looking for those papers to tell us that. I found in the National Archives a document from the Atomic Energy Commission where it states to President Truman, here in 1948 are the number of nuclear weapons we have, with a big underline and no number, because they would only tell him verbally. They would not write it down. Now, I found another copy eventually that had a number written down, but I don't know whether it was written down originally or somebody afterwards. But 50 was the number in that document for 48. By 1950, we're probably talking about a couple hundred, but it's a very small number. And one of the concerns why we didn't use weapons was we were still worried that the Soviets were going to invade Western Europe. And if they did, their conventional military superiority would force us to use nuclear weapons to stop them. And we were very concerned that we may not have enough, and so reluctant to use them in Korea. But that's just one of the concerns we had.
Before MacArthur was relieved of command by President Truman, he was advancing up towards the Chinese border. And at that time, the 1st Marine Division was on the west side, and the Army was on the east side. I have read that the Army units on the east side actually dissolved and had to be rescued. Is that correct?
So the question is, given the location of the forces, did the Army units on the east side of the advance up to the border, did they dissolve? There were actually Marines in that area as well. Did they dissolve? Well, you had thousands, tens of thousands of Chinese forces attacking them. The Chosin Reservoir was a terrible battle in terrible weather. They gradually were able to evacuate, though, with many losses, much attrition, in order to prevent it from completely falling apart. But yeah, it was a terrible battle. There were also many Korean forces that were involved in that push as well, and they suffered badly as well. Hopefully I'm not too scary for questions.
I have a question, Dr. Bennett.
Sure.
Do you think if Secretary Acheson had included South Korea in that original statement, do you think this would have happened?
So Kim Il-sung was asking Stalin for permission to invade South Korea. And Stalin was pretty clear that he had two concerns: American forces in South Korea and American support. But he was also concerned about whether the communist Chinese would back up the North Koreans. Because if the North Koreans round up in trouble, he didn't have the Soviet forces he wanted to send in. With that in mind, I think the question that we have to look at is, how much difference did the Acheson statement make? I think it potentially undermined the notion that the U.S. would necessarily support South Korea. Again, we only have a few hundred troops in South Korea, and they're not combat troops, they're trainers. So I think it had a role. It certainly wasn't the only role. There were, of course, lots of other things going on, but it clearly had a role, and in South Korea, it is viewed as a very bad thing to have happened. Got a question up here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Bennett. My name is M.K. Lee. I am immigrant Korean American, live in this area long time. Now, maybe this question is a little sensitive, but from your perspective, what do you think current situation in the Korean Peninsula and unification of South and North Korea is possible in the near future? Thank you.
Okay. Question is unification of North and South Korea possible in the near future? Let me give you two perspectives on that. Number one, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, has said unification is no longer possible. He has said that is not on the table. He will not work with the South Koreans on that. So from a North Korean perspective, he's not even willing to negotiate with the South, for that matter, even with the US right now. From a South Korean perspective, let me give you a different idea. South Korean army used to be about 560,000 troops. Right now, my best estimate is it's somewhere around 320 or 330. According to historical research on what it would take to occupy North Korea, even if the army in North Korea was defeated, that's not big enough. So the South Korean army, now they have lots of reserves, but your South Korean reserves train 3 days a year. 2 nights a year, 3 days. And oh, by the way, they get a chance to fire 10 rounds from a rifle. But the rifle's mounted in a box, so they can't turn around and shoot their colleagues. This is not the environment you need to be prepared for unification, to be able to occupy North Korea, because with as big an army as there is in North Korea, many of those soldiers would join a rebellion, like we saw in Iraq. So, are we ready in South Korea for it? The answer is no. I have a very good friend who used to be a senior North Korean official and defected a number of years ago. And he said that when he defected and came to South Korea, he spent a lot of time with the South Korean government, as they asked him to help advise them. And he concluded that even politically, that preparation wasn't there. So I have a very good book if you're interested. It's called Preparing for the Possibility of a North Korean Collapse. It's on the internet, and you can download it for free. It's about 350 pages, and it walks through all the issues of what you'd have to do to be prepared. I don't think we're prepared.
Thank you, sir. Then, in your perspective, without U.S. military presence in Korea, which if they withdraw totally, the own Korean government military, is they have own power for real readiness for the war happen again. Thank you.
Look, so the question is, does the South Korean military have the ability to handle situation with the North if the U.S. troops withdraw? Look, the South Korean military is very good. They've got great capabilities, nothing against them other than their reduction in numbers, which is partially political and partially demographic. You got to remember, in South Korea, you're getting something around 0.7 births per woman per lifetime. 0.7, which you have to have 2.1 to replicate the population. So it's well below the ability to sustain the South Korean population. And that's what's caused the drawdown heavily in the South Korean military. So it's not that the quality of the forces is bad, that the quality of the equipment is bad. It's that just the numbers. It's one thing to stop an invasion. It's another thing to go in and occupy a country. And that takes a lot of boots on the ground. And that's a challenge. Okay, you have another question?
Good afternoon, sir. My name is James Pock, and my question was with regards to your points with the nuclear weapons and the potential utilization of them, and then the European theater, et cetera. But did you, within your research and your reading, know if there was any actual targets or proposed targets within North Korea on the utilization of those nukes? And I guess the secondary question was also unrelated to that. But during your study and reading of the North Korean regime, in today's current state, whether or not the Kim Jong-un, in his statements, they say a lot of rhetoric, but whether there's any serious intent to obviously not unify, but come down and invade or attack South Korea again.
Okay, so questions with regard to Kim Jong-un. Has he given up on invasion of the South? Does he still want to unify some way if it's not peaceful unification? And I'm sorry, your earlier question was? Nuclear weapons, yes. 1950, the talk I've seen about nuclear weapon use in 1950 was the bridges over the Yalu. Weren't many. So between China and North Korea, they would have been an interesting target that would have prevented China from being able to introduce forces had they been taken out. So that was discussed. I don't know if there was a military plan to do that, but it was certainly discussed at the time. Sorry, my mind is running. Your second question was again?
Sorry, I was kind of rambling a bit for my questioning, but the secondary question was just whether or not your estimate with regards to the current regime with invading South Korea. Again, and obviously, there's a lot of deterrence for that with the military. But
I have kind of a different perspective than many experts. My perspective is, look at what Kim Jong-un is doing to prevent outside information from getting into the North. He is trying everything he can to keep outside information out of the North. Just really struggling because his elites hear that information and they start to question the regime. So he has been struggling mightily to do that. I think if he sent troops into South Korea, there would be a level of ideological contamination of his troops that would probably doom the regime at some point in time. Doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a military takeover in the North or something else, but I doubt the Kim Jong-un regime would survive that. So I think his idea is he wants to try and take over the South, not by occupying the South now. I think he'd like to be able to see the US-ROC alliance broken so that that's lost. And if you look at public opinion polls in South Korea, the polls I've seen say, even today, about a plurality of South Korean people think that North Korea is militarily superior because of their nuclear weapons. If the alliance is broken, that's going to become even more so. And I think Kim Jong-un would be happy to be able to tell South Korea, look, I really don't want to harm you. Just give me $50 billion a year. Okay? Just $50 billion a year, less than 5% of your GDP. That would allow me to purchase my weapons. That would allow me to take care of a little bit my people. I don't want 100 billion because that would make some of my people too rich. And when they get rich, they can bribe officials. Don't want that. Oh, and by the way, South Korea, no more K-pop. That's just damaging to my people. That undermines my control of my youth. So I think he would like to be able in a position to have a degree of dominance, but not total control. I think that's where he goes. Now, does that mean he's giving up on the military option? Absolutely not. He needs it as a planning factor. But what happens if his military decides to rebel against him? He doesn't want them moving on Pyongyang. If they decide to rebel against him, I think he tells them, go invade South Korea. Because they're invading South Korea, they're not going to be moving on Pyongyang. So it's retained, I think, as an alternative. But it's not the main plan, I think, for him right now. And look what he's doing in terms of trying to break the alliance. He's doing a lot of interesting things in that regard.
We have time for one more question.
So I know that in regards to the Soviet Union's collapse, that happened because the last leader had some more like liberal, like more progressive policies that allow for like freedom of speech, this and that. Do you think that with Kim Jong-un's like new heir that he's been like, debuting, do you think that if she were to take over like his regime, that they might follow in the footsteps of the Soviet Union?
Well, we know very little in detail about Kim Ju-ae, the daughter who seems to be pushed forward. What's her training like? Who's been teaching her? How's she been advancing? So it's really, really hard to tell there. Undoubtedly, he's been indoctrinating her, and he's probably been telling her, you have to have military and political control to survive, the combination. So I think the chances of it going the direction of Gorbachev, not too well. And that was the question, was this a situation where it could be like at the end of the Soviet Union, where someone in North Korea could succeed but create a peaceful situation? You know, I think she's got to be figuring that if she tries to go in that direction, she's a dead woman. Well, thank you very much, all. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dr. Bennett. I'll have probably about 10 or 15 more questions for you at the reception later. That was very, very interesting. So our next speaker is James Zobel. He is the archivist of the MacArthur Memorial, where he has served since 1993, maintaining an extensive collection that includes General Douglas MacArthur's personal papers. He is recognized as a leading expert on General MacArthur and is the author of MacArthur, the Supreme Commander at War. His work supports the preservation of the collection housed in the Gene MacArthur Research Center and ensures its accessibility to researchers around the world. So please join me in welcoming James Zobel.
Thanks, Amanda. It's really good to see you all here today. Thanks for coming. Let's see if I can start this out. There we go, right there. Brigadier General Edward Simmons, he ran Marine Corps history in the 1980s and 1990s. And as a young officer, a Marine officer, he had been at Incheon himself. In the late 1950s, he was asked by the Encyclopedia Britannica to write an article about amphibious invasions. And when he put this together, he left Incheon out because Incheon had violated the 7 principles of landing an amphibious invasion. As well, it had been, a great deal of luck that was involved. And so then this was turned back to Britannica, and it goes to their reviewers. And the reviewer came back to Simmons. It was like, you left out Incheon. What's going on? This was the greatest thing that ever happened. It totally destroyed the Inman gun, restored the South Korean Republic into power. How could you have left that out? And so Simmons changed it. It wasn't until many years later that he found out his reviewer was actually Douglas MacArthur and was, very perturbed that this had been left out of it. Yes, this was Douglas MacArthur's crowning achievement, one of the boldest movements of his 52-year career. Calculated risk, audacity. It's amazing that they were able to put this force together almost overnight, directed by all those veteran legendary heroes of World War II. And that's really why this thing all pulls off as it does. And it's probably one of the greatest achievements in military history. And so we'll delve into a little bit about this because this is the anniversary of that. Of course, as Dr. Bennett said, the invasion comes June 25th, 10 divisions, 130,000 North Koreans, 6,000 man tank brigade, over 120 T-34s, all these Russian 120 millimeter mortars. They've gotten very good at anti-aircraft. It's basically a Russian army that's coming out because they've all been trained by the Russians. They've all been trained by the Communist Chinese. They've had, as you said, General Steikov, who was there and advising all these people. And so you have this thing run through, and the Koreans, like we said, they can't handle it because they don't have any firepower that is able to react to those T-34s. Now, President Truman was very tired of having to deal with the communists. They'd been pushing into Greece. They'd been pushing into Turkey. There'd been all that communist insurgency, as we were talking about, in the Koreas, coming down through the mountains and then populating the south of Korea as well. The communist Chinese had just taken over China in October of 1949, and the Russians had exploded their own bomb in August of 1949. So it was very pressing on Truman that he had to stand up to this at this point. And of course, as we said, he had people within his own group that were putting Korea outside the littoral defense, but that didn't really matter now. Truman was going to make a stand. He felt he had to make a stand at this time. There was no other choice. So he goes to the UN and is going to get a mandate from them, but he wants to have an assessment of what is going on the ground. And so he gets a hold of Douglas MacArthur, serving as Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers in the occupation of Japan, and he says, I need an assessment of what is happening. MacArthur, at 70 years old now, gets on the plane and flies to Kimpo almost immediately. That is Seoul's airport at this point. This is MacArthur at the Han River. He got into Kimpo and drove right to the Han River. There he is with all the generals. They're watching the South Koreans evacuating Seoul because the North Koreans have pushed down that Uijeongbu corridor. They've gone right for Seoul. They couldn't hold them off, and now they're all streaming across. And MacArthur is standing there, and he's immediately thinking, amphibious move. This is what I'm going to have to do. These people are going to push everybody down to the south, and we're going to have to come in here with an amphibious move because that's what they did all throughout World War II. It's replaying World War II strategy for him, basically. And MacArthur comes back to Japan, and immediately he takes Pinky Wright, that's the man on the right there, and Wright was his G3 operations officer. And in 1949, the JCS had told MacArthur to create this Joint Staff Planning Operations Group, which has Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines that then plan things. And so as soon as they get back to Japan, MacArthur tasked that group with coming up with this operation called Blue Hearts, which he's going to use the 1st Cavalry Division to land at Incheon in late July of 1950. Now, he's got to throw all those troops into the breach, though, because the North Koreans are moving pretty fast. And so on July 10th through the 15th, as we said, Task Force Smith goes in. He throws in these troops piecemeal. They don't have anything to stop them, but it causes the North Koreans to stop, deploy, and delays their advance, as then MacArthur's able to throw in 3 of those occupation divisions, the 1st Cavalry Division, 24th, 25th Divisions, in there to that Pusan perimeter, where Walton Walker is going to then set up the perimeter with 5 Korean divisions as well from the Republic of Korea to be able to hold off this Pusan perimeter. Now, MacArthur is knowing he's got to stabilize this defense, but then when he throws in that 1st Cavalry Division, there goes Operation Blue Hearts out the window. He's not going to be able to do this now with those troops, and so now he's going to have to put them in there just to be able to delay this. But he's still going to be working towards this Incheon operation. Now, this is Lieutenant General Lemuel Shepard. He runs Fleet Marine Forces. He knew MacArthur from World War II. He had been assistant division commander at that time when they went into New Britain, so these guys know each other. Now, the Congress, as well as the JCS, had said they would give MacArthur the 2nd Division, as well as the 5th Regimental Combat Team, 5th Marines. Shepard comes out there as Fleet Forces Marine Commander to talk about what's going to happen with these 5th Marines once they get to Japan. And MacArthur starts telling him, look, I really need that 1st Marine Division. I need them now. I can't do this with Army guys. I need Marines to be able to pull off this Incheon operation I'm doing. And Shepard says, well, I run them, but I'm going to need the JCS to tell me that, yeah, this can happen. And so MacArthur had him sit down at a typewriter right outside the office, type out the message that's going to be sent to the JCS, and that's what happens. He says, we need to constitute the 1st Marine Division at this moment. Now, this goes to Clifton B. Cates, who's the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and there really is no 1st Marine Division. I mean, they've pared everything down. They've got basically nothing. You've got troops at Lejeune, you've got some at Pendleton, and you're going to have to empty all those places to be able to fulfill this 1st Marine Division. So what happens is that 5th Marine Regiment, all the people from Pendleton clear out. And Pendleton's now cleared. Then they're going to have to use all those Lejeune guys from the East Coast in the 2nd Marine Division to fill out that 1st Marines that's going to be happening. Also, they're asking for the 7th Marines to be reconstituted too. And what they're going to do is they're going to take every Marine out of every Navy yard, guarding every place, to be able to then constitute this 7th Marine Regiment. You had the 6th Marines floating in 3rd Battalion, floating over in the Mediterranean. They're immediately turned to the 3rd or the 7th, and so now they're putting together this unit that will be able to do this, to make this. And then here comes all the guys. O.P. Smith, Guadalcanal, 6 Marines, he commanded 3 Marine regiments. He was assistant division commander on Peleliu. He was the deputy chief of staff on Okinawa. Then you've got Chesty Puller, of course, who had been all through Guadalcanal, New Britain, Peleliu. Ray Murray, who's going to command the 5th Marines. Same thing. Homer Litzenberg, going to command the 7th Marines. All these guys are experts at what they do, and they know it very well. And that's the thing. You're going to have a lot of raw recruits. You're going to have a lot of reservists come in, but a lot of these guys were veterans of World War II as well, and that's what I mean. They had done all this before. Here's your Navy guys. Rear Admiral Doyle, Vice Admiral Struble. These are Pacific guys as well. Doyle had run all those landing operations at Guadalcanal all throughout the Solomons from 46 to 48. He ran the amphibious command for the Navy, even though the Navy was paring down. They had gone from like 651 amphibious ships down to about 91 pieces in just those 4 years. You really got nothing. As well, you've got Arthur Struble. He had been the amphibious commander with the 7th Fleet under MacArthur during World War II. So these guys all know each other. And MacArthur gets a hold of them before Shepard had come out on the 10th and said, this is what I'm going to do. And so there's really a very small force, and they start coalescing all these forces of ships within Japan. They bring in a couple of these jeep carriers, Bedong Straits of Sicily, and then as well you've got one British carrier that's going to come on, and these guys will put together this Task Force 90 that will then take the invasion force into Incheon. Struble is full for this. Doyle will say that it's not impossible. And that's all he'll say, because everything is going against this. Now, the thing is that in October of 1949, General Omar Bradley, that's him down there on the right with MacArthur. He had come out there in June of 1950. But in 1949, he had told the House Armed Services Committee there will never be another major amphibious operation ever again. They were trying to gut the Navy as well as the Marine Corps of all of their aviation and put it under Hoyt Vandenberg of the Air Force. They were trying to gut the Navy at this point. They were thinking only in terms of nuclear warfare. Now, the thing is that in 1949, MacArthur had gotten hold of the Navy and said, I want to start training all my guys for amphibious operations. And so the Navy sent out this small contingent of landing craft, Mount McKinley, the attack command ship, and they sent Rear Admiral James Doyle. So Doyle comes out there and he starts running this amphibious command. Now, when Bradley shows up in June of 1950, right before the war starts, it's incredible. It's like just a couple of days. But he meets Doyle, and he's like, what are you doing here? And Doyle's, well, I've been running this amphibious training command for MacArthur. And Bradley was just miffed, because he says that amphibious training is just basically worthless. Well, Doyle goes and has a meeting with MacArthur and tells him this is what Bradley said. And MacArthur said he's a farmer. Now, does that mean that Bradley is this landlubber who doesn't know anything about the ocean? Or does MacArthur say that Bradley's a farmer because he plants soldiers? MacArthur will say a lot about Bradley after this as well, but that's what it comes down to. So MacArthur's putting together this invasion fleet. He's got the 1st Marines working on trying to put the division together. He's got the JCS who are kind of in the dark about everything that's going on, but he's got the professional capabilities of all these Pacific veterans that will be able to put this together once the JCS says, yes, we will have a go with this. Pusan's at the brink. When that 5th Marine Regiment gets there, he has to immediately throw them into the Pusan perimeter as well. Under Walton Walker, you can see him right down there. He had been one of Patton's tank commanders in World War II. And they have to throw them in there because the North Koreans are very close to breaking everything. Now, Walker has good signal intelligence. He knows when the North Koreans are going to make their moves. He's got the 27th Wolfhounds under Michaelis, and he's got the 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Brigade under Edward Craig. And they are able to be his fire brigades. Whenever things get hottest, he can plug them in and hold off that Pusan perimeter. But MacArthur had been hoping to use the 5th Regiment and the 2nd Division for that Incheon invasion, but then he had to throw them into the brink immediately. And he says time is of the essence, and it was a very close run thing that they were able to hold this off until they could put together this Incheon operation. Operation Chromite 100B. Now, on August 10th, the JCS agreed to send MacArthur the 1st Marine Division. And then on October 12th, that Joint Staff Planning Group came out with this, the Incheon operation. They put together also an invasion on Kunsan, which is lower down on the west coast, and they had put one at Koryu Junmunjin. That's on the east coast at this point. But MacArthur is all about going into Incheon. Now, the JCS has a lot of reservations about this. Bradley and J. Lawton Collins, who's the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, these guys' idea of amphibious operations is Anzio and D-Day, both of which were big slaughters. They don't know about all these Pacific operations. They know about them, but they don't know how, the intricacies of all this and how these guys are able to put this together. Now, they're very worried about this. They believe that maybe they should, like Amanda was saying, just put the forces there in Pusan and break out from there. And so what they do is they start feeling that they need to talk to MacArthur about the plan because he hasn't sent them the plan at this point. And so what happens is J. Lawton Collins and Forrest Sherman, who's the Chief of Naval Operations, on late August, they fly out to Tokyo. And there's Collins there, there's Sherman right on the left of MacArthur, and Admiral Rafford, who's the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Now, Hoyt Vandenberg, who was the Air Force general, does not go there because MacArthur had stated before they even came out there that Marine and naval air power are going to be controlling this thing. The Air Force will not be involved whatsoever because that's the way they did it in World War II. MacArthur's not going to change the plans because he knows that's going to work. And so you've got all these Marine air units that had come out there with that 1st Marine Brigade that went into Pusan, and you're going to have a lot more coming. They're going to be stationed on those Badong Straits and the Sicily, these 2 jeep carriers, and they'll cover the whole operation at this point. Now, when they get out there, Sherman immediately flies to Struble down at Sasebo, Kyushu, down on the lowest southernmost island of Japan. That's where the base is. And he goes on board and says, what are you guys doing? What is going on with this thing? And Struble's full for it. And he convinces Sherman, that this is the way that's going to happen. Does he convince him actually? No, but Sherman is a guy that knew MacArthur as well. He had been one of those Pacific commanders. He's got a trust in this thing that this could probably work. Struble's all for it. He talks to Doyle as well. Doyle's a little bit more conservative about this, but Sherman is going to come back to Tokyo, and MacArthur knows that's the guy he has to convince. He's not worried about Collins, but it's going to have to be Sherman that he convinces. The next day, Major General O.P. Smith shows up. Now, he is going to be commanding the 1st Marine Division. He goes to see MacArthur right as he gets there, and he goes in there, and MacArthur, he finds him, he's very up on everything. He knows all the facets of this operation, how it's going to be. But Smith says he's almost got this mystical belief that this is going to come off. This is something that is mystical to MacArthur. It's not confidence. It's something different entirely. Then you have the conference, the Incheon conference that comes up. And MacArthur gets into the room with J. Lawton Collins, Forrest Sherman. They did the dumbest thing they could do. They got into a closed room with MacArthur. You've got General Wright, who gets up and talks about the operation, the guy from the planning staff. Then you have 9 Navy planners that get up. They talk about all the obstacles. You've got the 40-foot tide differential. If you go in there, everybody's going to be stuck on the beach for 8 hours. As well, you've got these 14-foot seawalls. Flying Fish Channel, which takes you up into Incheon itself, is very small, very secluded. You've got some of these planners that are saying, we're going to need 18 days of bombardment to be able to do this. And Sherman basically spoke up and said, 18, what are you talking about? It's going to take about 2 days to level this place. And MacArthur's like, okay, this is looking good. And then they're talking about Doyle, who's the amphibious commander, says, well, I'm worried about taking ships up Flying Fish Channel. And for Sherman again, I would hesitate take my destroyer up that channel. And MacArthur's like, spoken like a farragut. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Sherman's his boy. Now this is the greatest thing going on. And so the conference ends, and of all the planners speaking, and then MacArthur gets up to give his address. And everybody's like, great, he's going to talk about the operation. And MacArthur gets up and starts talking about Wolfe and Montcalm in the French and Indian War. What is he talking about? To MacArthur, it's all surprise. It doesn't matter what year it is. It doesn't matter what kind of weapons you have. The element of surprise is everything about warfare. All those obstacles that you just pointed out are the very reason they won't expect us coming out. I'll land at Incheon and I'll crush them. And Sherman, a great voice and a great cause. And then they all leave the room and they're like, man, what did we just agree to? All the Marines get together. We need to go in lower down. We need to go somewhere else. We need to, talk to MacArthur about this. And Lem Shepard went back to MacArthur the next day saying, we need to go to Pyeongchang, which is right south of that where the Marines wanted to land. And MacArthur, again, for a half hour was like, no, this is going to happen. I can feel it. This is it. Incheon is the one. That mystical belief, so to speak. Thing is right at this time that MacArthur is meeting with the JCS, he has his VFW message published to the veterans of foreign wars. Now, MacArthur had gone to Taiwan, Formosa, at the end of July, something that the United States State Department, as well as the JCS, were very worried about because they didn't want the Red Chinese getting involved in the Korean War, even though they were already full into it. So when MacArthur comes back from that trip to Formosa, all of a sudden the JCS finds out MacArthur's about to send planes down there. He's putting supplies there in case planes have to land. And then Truman and everybody starts freaking out. And so they send Averell Harriman out there to talk to MacArthur and said, look, we're trying to keep the Reds out of this. You can't talk about them. You have to keep quiet. And MacArthur's like, I promise I won't say anything. And then a couple of days later, here comes the VFW message. Formosa is a unsinkable aircraft carrier. The Red Chinese can never have it. Just causing total havoc with all the policy of the United States at that point. But Truman doesn't fire him. He orders him to recant it, even though it's been published everywhere, because MacArthur is really the only guy that believes in this Incheon operation, and this thing has been given, tacit approval at this point, and they don't get rid of him. MacArthur puts together 10th Corps. That's going to be the invasion force. Is going to be that 1st Marine Division, as well as that last occupation division that is in Japan, the 7th Division. They didn't have enough people. All their people went to fill the 24th, the 25th, and the 1st Cav when they went to Korea. So MacArthur has to do a buddy system with South Koreans that will come in there. 31st, 32nd Infantry. As well, he'll attach the 17th Republic of Korea Infantry Regiment to this group. And they will be the ones that are going to go into Incheon. Now, MacArthur does not put Almond under the superior commander, the Lieutenant General, 8th Army. He has them both separate, and they report to him, and this is going to cause a lot of problems later on. It'll cause problems at Incheon, but nothing that's going to affect this point. Now, Walker and Almond hate each other. Mostly their wives hated each other. And there's a lot going on with these two, and it's going to be a lot after that as well. Here it is, a week before the operation. Here comes the message from the JCS. Are you sure we should do this? We don't know about this. And here's MacArthur's reply. What is the matter with you? It's going to be the greatest thing anybody's ever seen. This is going to happen. It's going to work. Everything's going to be pulled off. And they agree to it a week before. Now the secret. It wasn't a secret. They called it Operation Common Knowledge. That's what all the newspaper people called it, because practically everyone knew. They start loading all the ships at Sasebo, as well as Yokohama, Kobe. But the greatest secret was that there are 47 LSTs. These are the big landing ship tanks they have. Now, the United States Navy at that point only had 19 of them. They had gotten rid of all of them after World War II. 34 of them are serving in the inland seafaring maritime units of the Japanese, and they're being used as fishing trawlers and everything else. The great secret is 34 of those LSTs are going to be captained by Japanese, and they will have their crews be Japanese that move into Incheon. There's 2 typhoons that come along. Typhoon Jane, Typhoon Kiza. They're very worried that they're going to hit it right when it goes into the waters getting into Incheon, but luckily they avoid they go off and do not affect anything. They have some ships that are jostled when they're loading them there, but that's about it. MacArthur flies down to Kyushu and then takes a 80-mile car ride to Sasebo. It's the only time he left Tokyo in that 6.5 years. One of the most beautiful countries in the world, and MacArthur saw none of it. He only saw the route from the embassy to the Daiichi building every day. Flies down there, goes down, gets on board with Doyle. This is a ship that's got a lot of people that are pretty high brass. You've got Doyle on there, you've got O.P. Smith on there, you've got Lem Shepard on there, you've got General Wright on there, Almond on there. All the main commanders are on this USS Mount McKinley that's going to be going right into Incheon with the fleet. Here's how they leave. All the slowest ships left from Yokohama on the 5th. The Marines left on the 11th from Sasebo. That's when MacArthur and the McKinley leave as well. As they get around Pusan, they pick up that 1st Marine Brigade. The 5th Regiment joins them there. And then they push up into the waters of Incheon off the west coast of. Now, also, they use Lieutenant Eugene Clark and his Korean liaison organization. They're going to land there and turn on the lights at Polmido. This is a lighthouse that lights up the straits that gets them into Incheon. MacArthur didn't even know about this. When they saw the lights go on there, MacArthur was like, the North Koreans have taken it over. They're firing it up. That's how secret this operation was, to get them into the straits there. USS Toledo, or the HMS Jamaica and the HMS Kenya, 2 British ships. These are your big cruisers. They're going to be throwing 8-inch shells from 10 miles out. They start the bombardment on the 13th, 2 days before. Like Sherman said, they'll be taking out all those positions in there. The day before, they'll throw in all the destroyers that get in real close to the shore bombardment there. And that's Wolmido Island, which is right off of Incheon. That is going to be the first target. Green Beach is there because they need to take that Radio Hill. Everything about Incheon campaign, everything about the move to Seoul is all based on taking that high ground and moving to the next piece of high ground. And so when they come in to the destroyers came in real close. They found out that the 918th North Korean anti-aircraft battalion was there, and they had 76 millimeters, and the Gurk and the Colette caught some pretty heavy fire, but then they get silenced by the the evening of the 14th. They've got pretty much everything secured as far as that goes. Next morning is the morning assault. You're gonna have 2 assaults in the morning and then at the evening because of those tides like we talked about. The 3rd of the 5th Marines under Robert Taplett, they're going to go into Wolmido. Their task is to close off that causeway, which connects it to Incheon, as well as to take that Radio Hill to be able to control that high point there. MacArthur watches it from the deck of the Missouri, and he puts out a message that morning that says, "Never have the Navy and the Marine Corps shone so brightly at this point." After the invasion and then the tides went out, MacArthur went on a harbor tour on the USS Mount McKinley's draft. Here's all the brass on there. MacArthur was very fired up about this. About 4:30, that's when everything's going to start happening for that second invasion, and that's when all the crescendo of everything starts to take off once again. Explosions, the Marine Air Corps coming in to cover everything as they move into these points. Now this is the second. Now that afternoon assault is covering the Blue Beach area right there. That's where the 1st Marines are going to land. And up there at Red Beach is where those other 2 battalions of that 5th Marines are going to land. You've got seawalls at here. So as you can see, they have to carry these ladders with them. That's 1st Lieutenant Baldemaro Lopez. He was with the 5th Marines that landed there at Red Beach up on the top there. He was killed right after that picture was taken. He had taken out a North Korean machine gun nest and then lost his life because of that. The landings that afternoon with the 1st Marines were very confusing. It's darkness, rain is starting to fall, you've got smoke everywhere, and there's supposed to be 30 Navy guide boats to bring in these troops. You can fit 4 platoons on 8 of these LVTs that are going in there, but they only had 4 of those guide boats. That's how low they were working on all the shipping that they really needed for this amphibious operation. But because they are all these experts of World War II, they're able to adapt, they're able to confront all the problems they have, and they're able to get all their directives and all their targets by about midnight that night. They bring in all those LSTs, they unload 8 of them that night, and the next morning they're able to pull out with the tide. And it's about, like I said, about midnight that they're able to secure everything. Incheon is secured. Now, attached to the 5th Marines, you had Colonel Shin's Korean Marine Corps. There are 3 battalions with them now. This is a picture of him as a lieutenant general later on. He's really the father of the Korean Marine Corps. But it's the 2nd Battalion of the Korean Marines under Major Kim that come in after that first day. And they're the ones that clean up Incheon because they're able to pick out who the North Koreans are, who the South Koreans are. They're the ones, and it's very important that they are there because they make Incheon a safe place, almost like within a day after landing there at Incheon. Now the 1st and the 5th are going to have to saddle up because now their job is to move into Seoul. Now Incheon to Seoul on the 16th, the 1st and the 5th Marines, they hook up. The 5th Marines, they're going to be moving up north to Gimpo. That's the airport up there. That's what they're going to seize. And the 1st Marine Division is going to be moving to Yeongdeungpo, which is right outside of Seoul. Like I said, everything is about going from one hill to the next to be able to take that. You've got Marine Air that's all over them. You've got a tank brigade of Pershings that has landed there with the Marines. They will move out with them as well. As the 5th Marines are moving up to Gimpo, Major Kim and another Major Kim of the Korean Marines, they'll clear out all that Gimpo Peninsula up on the top of the north and cover that flank. Now, Chesty Puller's 1st Marines, as they're moving, they've got a wide open south because the 7th Division hasn't landed, and so he has to use his 1st battalion down south. Jack Hawkins runs this. Jack Hawkins, if you didn't know, he got captured on Corregidor, was thrown into the Japanese death camps, escaped from Davao Penal Colony, was one of 10 that escaped, and then he was on Iwo Jima right after that. And here he is commanding the 1st Battalion of Puller's Regiment. And so they'll be able to cover that south until the 7th gets into there. D+2, MacArthur goes ashore. He meets with O.P. Smith, and Smith has a briefing with his G2 intelligence, G3 operations, tell MacArthur about it, and then MacArthur wants to go to the front. Now, they had wiped out 6 T-34s that had been trying to make a move into Incheon. The air power of the Marines took out 3 of them, but the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines took out the other 3. And MacArthur gets right up to this point, and he's looking over these tanks. Ray Murray, who's the commander of the 5th Marine Regiment, goes up to MacArthur, hey, we got some fresher kills up forward. And MacArthur's, well, what are we doing? Come on, let's go. MacArthur's always wants to be up there where the action is. And you've got O.P. Smith there, shut up. You're going to get the Supreme Commander killed right at the front lines. But once Murray says that, that's where they go, is up to the front. And there's MacArthur standing right at the hill with everyone. Chesty Puller's sitting there right next to MacArthur and all the rest of the brass. Once again, that Brigadier General Edward Simmons, who was that young officer that ran Marine Corps history, he was there. And he said, you had all this brass, all these stars, but the only person you saw was MacArthur, just because everything he had said had come true, and there was no focus on anybody else that was on that hill. Everybody knew what had happened and what he had pulled off. Rest of the 10th Corps comes ashore on the 18th. 7th Division's going to move in to the south. Now, they're not up to the caliber of the 1st Marine Division. Of course, they had been thrown together haphazard. You've got that 17th ROK that's working with them. You've got a lot of language problems with all that buddy system that's going on. But Major General David Barr is very good at getting the most out of the people that he can. He's also very cooperative, working with the Navy as well as the Marines. And that's why this thing works. Because people like O.P. Smith, Barr, James Doyle, MacArthur, they're all very much into this cooperating with others. Now, you've got other people that are not so much into that. You've still got a lot of this inter-service rivalry going on between the Army and the Marines, but these people are the ones that are going to make this happen. The 7th Marines land as well. They take over from those ROK Marines that are working in the north part, and they'll be there for a couple of days getting acclimated, but then they'll go into the front lines with the Marines and the Army as they start pushing in to Seoul. MacArthur will depart on the 20th. 21st. He goes on a last visit to all the headquarters right at the front. He's right there with Chesty Puller at Yeongdeungpo as they're about to move across the Han and go towards Seoul at this point. They'll have to use Amtraks on all these because the bridging equipment never arrived. And then the next day he'll go visit the USS Missouri, where the surrender had happened just before that, but then he'll fly out on the 21st. And that's when Major General Almond finally comes ashore and 10th Corps takes over. It was unheard of. You know, usually the Army or the commanders of the land forces would be there on D+1, but Almond would always say it was because MacArthur was still on the ship. He was basically in command. That's why he didn't come ashore, though not many people would understand that. And then the battle for Seoul. You've got an 8-day battle. Thing is Major General Wol Ki-chan had moved in. You've got the 18th Division of the North Koreans, the 20th 5th Brigade, 70th 8th Independent Regiment that all coalesce there at Seoul, and they're going to fight street to street. You have east of Seoul, you have this mountain complex that the Japanese had used as a training ground during World War II, and that's where Wol is going to really set up his defenses there. And the North Koreans proved that they are very adept at using all that Russian military equipment. This is going to be a very hard fight. Once the Army and the Marines get across the Han, they will compress on the city, but you're not getting a lot of air power helping because the NKPA, the North Korean People's Army, is very good at anti-aircraft defense, and they call Seoul the Corsair Trap, because that's where they start getting shot down. They'll have to compress this, going street by street to be able to take this. The thing is on the 25th of September, Major General Almond will declare that the fight is over, that the Seoul is secured. That's because it was the 90-day period since the war had begun, but it's not over. You've got 3-4 more days of serious fighting to take the rest of Seoul. Walton Walker finally broke out on the 23rd. It wasn't until the 21st of September that the North Koreans announced that the invasion force had landed at Incheon, saying they'll crush them before Seoul. But when that word gets to everybody down south, as like Dr. Bennett said, that's when they disintegrate and start moving north. And that's when Walton Walker is able to break out. He had a very, very hard time turning them from a defensive-minded attitude into an attack attitude. And finally, when they got out, the 1st Cavalry Division moves north at a rapid pace, and on the 27th they meet the 31st Infantry, or 31st Infantry there at Osan, and that breakup is done. And the next day is when Seoul falls and Seoul's retaken. You've wiped out about 14,000 NKPA. You've taken about 9,000 prisoners. This was everything MacArthur had predicted, that if they go in there, clamp down on that supply, that and as well shown that they have wiped out all contingencies there, that North Korean army would dissolve, which it did, goes back north of the parallel. And then the next day, MacArthur flies back and they restore the capital. They restore the government to the capital, something that the State Department and the JCS were against. And MacArthur was like, what are you talking about? This is the guy who's the freely elected president of South Korea. This is their country. Of course we're going to restore them to power at this point. And Syngman Rhee. And MacArthur gave a short address, and then he read the Lord's Prayer and cried throughout the entire thing as he pulled this off. There was about 3,500 casualties for the Allied forces, and about 2,400 of them would be Marines at this point. Back at the Pentagon, that's what they start calling MacArthur, the sorcerer of Incheon, because he had pulled this thing off when everybody was pretty much against him. Secretary of Defense Marshall, the day before they had restored power, he had sent MacArthur basically a message that said, we want you to feel unhampered tactically and strategically to wipe out the rest of the North Korean army, means going north. And as well, Truman then gets another mandate that puts them across. They probably should have stopped the war right then. They had reached the status quo antebellum, but Truman wants to reunite the country, and MacArthur's a rollback kind of guy. And so this is MacArthur's last great triumph of his career. Thanks, y'all. Great, no questions?
No,
Thank
we
you.
have about 5 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. There's a microphone making its way around the room.
Jim, thank you for the great presentation. My question is around the North Koreans. They had no recollection, did he think about the possibility that Incheon would be a target? Why were they so unprepared, or were they unprepared?
Well, they did know it was a target, and they had brought in all the mines, that they were going to mine all that area. And that was the greatest thing that the Navy was worried about, that the Koreans had already mined all those shallow channels. When they got in there, they did find a couple of mines, but they had never been able, they hadn't done it all the way yet. I mean, so they knew that that was a port that could be invaded, and they, were sending troops in there, but they hadn't done it yet. And the firepower of the U.S. Navy, as well as all the Marine Air and Naval Air, was just too much for them. I mean, you had maybe about 2,500 troops that were there around Incheon, and they all get destroyed at that point. And they all fought to the death. I mean, these guys meant business. There's no doubt about that. And everybody that fought against them said they were some of the best troops they had ever come across. It was just too late. If they had mined it, it would have been like Wonsan later on, where it took 2 weeks to get into, the port at that point.
At the start of the presentations, the gentleman said that he read the letter he had received from Douglas MacArthur Jr. And is there much correspondence that you have with him?
Well, the foundation is in touch with him all the time, but the only time I ever met him was when we buried his mom, and he came down for about 4 days. He thought that was really strange because I knew all the kids he had grown up with, and I was like, when's the last time you talked to him? He's like, oh, it's been about 6 years. I was like, yeah, I was talking to him yesterday. And he was just like, okay, this is kind of weird. But a great guy. I mean, he was willing to talk about everything, and I hope he gets, more involved, with what we do.
Sir, you mentioned that the Japanese LSTs provided support. Were there other merchant ships that provided support to the Incheon Landing, or support overall?
Yeah, I mean, you're gonna bring in most of your stuff through that, that's coming through. Most of these are going to be Navy ships. I've never heard of maritime freighters or anything like that was attached to that. This was, mostly all those LSTs that are going to bring in all those supplies. After they took Incheon, the next day they closed down the one beach there, and they opened this yellow beach, which was then able to funnel in all the supplies they were going to need. They brought in signal equipment. They brought it, turned it into a light show there, and it basically made it the supply depot for everything that was going on through Seoul. But I've heard of the LSTs, LSDs, all these Navy type ships, but I've never heard of civilian freighters or anything like that.
We have time for just 2 more questions.
My understanding, of course, what MacArthur did was audacious, and it was quite an accomplishment with the rise and fall of the tides and the wall that the Marines had to go over. But my understanding was that once they got into Incheon, that direct area was basically uncontested. Is that correct?
Well, they like I said, they had to take those hills where most of the North Koreans had concentrated. They had this observatory hill that was right by Red Beach. You had that radio hill that was right by Womido. The 1st Marines had a hill that they had to get. And that's mostly where they had concentrated to be able to hold off the Americans, as well as the South Koreans that had moved in there as well. But yeah, they kill almost all of them. I mean, when the Korean Marines come through, they're taking a lot of, North Korean civilians and just the stragglers that are there. But all those North Koreans had fought, to the end. But it only took about a day, to end that. So it wasn't like Incheon was a big fight like Seoul. They were able to secure it very quickly. And mostly, because of those Korean Marines that were there.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for the great presentation. I heard a story, this was in 1964. Lyndon Johnson, right after he became president, he met Douglas MacArthur, and he warned Johnson about not committing troops to Vietnam. I don't know if you heard that. I
Yeah,
don't know if
it was
true.
on his. It was at Walter Reed just days before MacArthur dies. Johnson comes there and he tells him the same thing that he told Kennedy. We got no business putting an army into Asia. You know, there's nothing that we would be able to do there. You've got all these problems with the cities here in America. You know, with the disintegration of infrastructure, things like that. We need to concentrate on that. And that's what Kennedy used, you know, to ward off all these people. When they would say, we need to get involved and send all these advisors to Vietnam, Kennedy would be like, I got Douglas MacArthur telling me that we shouldn't do that. And basically, he told Johnson the same thing. You know. Great. All right. Thanks, y'all.
This concludes part 1 of the program. We'll have about a 5-minute break. Please, there's coffee and tea in the Great Hall, and then we will reset and return for the UNC Commanders panel.
So ladies and gentlemen, if you're out in the hallway, we'll go ahead and get started with the UNC Commanders Forum in 2 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. So if you can hear my voice and you're out in the hallway, please come back into the theater and we'll start our UNC Commanders Forum in about 2 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll start in 1 minute. So again, if you can hear me in the hallway, please make your way back into the theater. Okay, so if you're in the hallway, let's start to move back into the theater, please. Is it good? Is it okay? Okay, all right, good, all right. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you. We are now at the second part of our event, the UNC Commanders Forum. So before we do that, let's go ahead and give another round of applause to Dr. Bruce Bennett and Mr. Zim Zorbel. Thank you very much. Okay, I know that all of y'all have been around professors, historians. I don't think we had two gentlemen that literally brought that era and that battle to life like that. And so just a remarkable job, and we're very, very thankful that both of y'all were able to do that for us. So what a wonderful scene setter that takes us now 7 decades into the present, where we bring together 3 former UNC commanders at the home of the first UNC commander, General MacArthur. It's a historic event. So ladies and gentlemen, let me just introduce our moderator, who will introduce all of our 3 former commanders. So Lieutenant General retired Bill Burleson is a West Point graduate, like all of the panel members, and just like General MacArthur. General Burleson served as the Director of Operations for the United Nations Command, and then as the Commanding General of the 8th Army. in Korea from 2020 to 2024. So he and his wife Cindy live and are from the Army families. I'm sorry. They're both from Army families, and they have one son and a daughter. And he lives right up down the road in Williamsburg, Virginia. So, ladies and gentlemen, General Burleson.
Okay. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to come down here to the MacArthur Museum. But really, this is about the three gentlemen that are here next to me at this point. General Douglas MacArthur was the first United Nations Command commander, and since then, there have now been 33. So seated next to me is number 29, General Scaparrotti, number 30, General Brooks, and number 32, General LaCamera. So these three men seated next to me, if you add up their careers of service, it's over 120 years. Now, not all at one time, it's cumulative. And these are the successors from, the presentation that we just heard about. Those that helped in the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, people like, MacArthur, Ridgway, Clark. They're just a little bit farther down the line of succession. And really, since 1950, the United Nations Command has been that unique multinational military organization responsible for collective security, both during the war and after. And so this unbroken commitment to secure lasting peace and support for regional stability in Northeast Asia has been upheld by the United Nations Command, and these commanders next to me did it. They were responsible for enforcing the Armistice Agreement, overseeing the demilitarized zone, deterring provocations, and one of their favorite things, investigating violations of the Armistice. But these three gentlemen not only commanded the United Nations Command, they wore multiple hats. They were the commander of the ROC and U.S. Combined Forces Command, the commander of the U.S. Forces Korea, and they were the senior United States military officer assigned to Korea. So very shortly, and you can read their bios, I'm going to let each one of them sequentially sort of talk about those few things, the challenges or the things that they remember most as part of their introductory remarks. And so I'm going to start out first with General Scaparrotti, as I said, the 29th Commander of the United Nations Command. He commanded United Nations Command, U.S. Forces Korea, and Combined Forces Command. And then his subsequent assignment was the commander of U.S. European Command and the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. Additionally, he commanded the U.S. Army First Corps, as well as the 82nd Airborne Division. And we're glad to have his wife join us here today as well. Sir, over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Bill. Well, first off, I just want to thank you all for attending today, and particularly the MacArthur Memorial and the MacArthur Foundation and Korea Defense Veterans Association for supporting this. This is an important topic. It's one that I'm glad you came to hear about, both the Incheon Landing Memorial, this anniversary, but also UN Command, because it is something that doesn't come up very often, actually, but plays such a significant role. I commanded from 2013 to 2016. The memory of those times are, importantly, we had, during the time I was there, at least 3 times that we enacted what we called the crisis management of the CFC, the Combined Forces Command, because of serious provocations from North Korea. Most probably challenging was the box mine incident, where box mines planted severely wounded 2 Republic of Korea soldiers on patrol one morning, followed almost immediately behind that with an exchange of indirect fire across the border. That was in August of 15. During that time as well, we, in discussions with the Republic of Korea, shifted our focus on OPCON transition, the change of command between a Korean commander and a U.S. commander as the leader, as the lead 4-star of the alliance, from being set on a time basis to a set of conditions that we negotiated that would, when those conditions were met, would be the time that we might make that transition as well. And then we also rewrote and got approved with both the Korea Command or Secretary of Defense and the U.S. one, a new war plan if there were conflict on Korea, and that was a good deal of work over those 3 years. The one thing I would note as we begin this and before I go is that as we go through this discussion, just the continuity as we go through our discussions. The year I was there, we did a white paper on revitalizing United Nations Command. It was my belief that it was really one of the significant authorities that I had as a commander in those 3 hats. But it needed to be strengthened, and that was the revitalization piece of this. More personnel, multinational personnel. And I got that started. Vince Brooks, that came behind me, took it to a whole nother level, and it just continued on, and we may be able to pull that thread a bit.
Thank you, General Scaparrotti. Next, I'm going to introduce General Brooks, the 30th Commander of United Nations Command. And prior to that responsibility, he served as the Commander of the United States Army Pacific, as well as the Third Army, otherwise known as ARCENT. Additionally, he commanded the 1st Infantry Division. Over to you, General Brooks.
Okay, Bill, thank you very much, and thanks for moderating today. What an honor it is to be on the panel with these distinguished United Nations commanders and great friends for many years. It's a pleasure to follow General Scaparrotti and then try to set some conditions for Paul LaCamera, with one in between us, of course, and he's just recently come out of command. I also want to thank all of you for turning out today and coming to hear this discussion, and to recognize the continuing importance of United Nations Command. This is a command that's now 75 years and a few weeks old, and it is relevant today in a different way than it was in 1950, to be sure, as the roles have transitioned over time, and as South Korea especially has become more and more mature, and some of the war-fighting functions have been transferred to other entities. But United Nations Command remains very, very important on the Korean Peninsula and beyond. Remember, the United Nations Command has a bridge. It really strides both Korea and Japan. And we'll probably talk in some detail about that as we get further in. But there are bases in Japan to support operations in Korea, and that has been the case since the 1950s as the bases increased in number. The kinds of challenges we faced when I was in command from 2016, following General Scaparrotti, until 2018, was really a very changing environment. At the beginning, we had the traditional tension between North Korea and South Korea and the alliance. And we had participation by several of the United Nations sending states, all of the member nations, but the ones who had actually sent forces during the Korean War, some of them still had presence there. And this effort to try to revitalize UN Command was ongoing. So General Scaparrotti had gotten that started and it was rolling very, very well. But there are always challenges on articulating why is there UN Command still? What is its role? How does that relate then to the other commands, and especially to the sovereignty of the Republic of Korea? So one of the biggest challenges was always overcoming a concern that United Nations Command, with its broad authorities on maintaining the armistice, could impinge the sovereignty of South Korea. And indeed, that's true inside of the area of the demilitarized zone and the areas that are specified in the armistice agreement. But otherwise, that is not the case. Nevertheless, there's a long-standing feeling of that. And one of the challenges we faced right away was the effect of Chinese fishing boats coming into the Han River estuary. So this is where the Han River spills out into the West Sea. It's a contested area, and the estuary itself is inside of the armistice-controlled area. And Chinese fishermen were coming in and fishing in what is essentially a protected wildlife zone that is 70 years old. Crabs, especially, they were after, blue crabs. And it became a problem for both North Korea and South Korea, especially for South Korea domestically, that why are these fishermen allowed to be in the area when we, who live here, are not allowed to fish in that area? It became a diplomatic issue involving several nations, but especially China, South Korea, and the United States. Some discussion was occurring with North Korea also on this. And we ultimately created a United Nations maritime police force. So the UN flag was the authority we could use to keep South Korea from shooting at Chinese vessels in a space that's 400 yards from North Korea, which would become a problem. And it was the UN authority that allowed us to try to resolve that problem and eventually caused the Chinese fishing vessels to leave. It took about 2 years of operations, but we would simply cut their nets and drop them to the bottom as they fled toward the north. Then they'd get stuck in the mud flats like those that were concerned in the Incheon Landing, and then come back and find that all their harvests had been gone. Economically, it just wasn't going to work for them. That was UN command authority that made that possible. So these kind of tensions, also by the time of the end of my tour, we'd gotten through a period of tension that unlocked the door to dialogue. And now it was a matter of UN command being the key operator to facilitate discussion with North Korea, leading up to one of the most important operations I've ever participated in, and that was the repatriation of human remains of what we anticipated was Americans, but discovered it was far more than Americans who had perished during the Korean War. And those boxes were returned to us through the auspices of the United Nations Command, being able to have conversations with the North Korean People's Army. This is the kind of work that is done by United Nations Command on a given day. The preservation of the armistice, providing a home for international commitments from any other countries that might choose to assist and support, and enabling dialogue when it's important to do that. When other diplomatic channels have closed down, United Nations Command's communication channels tend to remain open, and it becomes the last link of communicating with North Korea when situations can cause a great deal of confusion. Honored to be with you today and look forward to the discussion, so thank you all very much.
Thank you, General Brooks. And finally, our final panel member is General Paul LaCamera, the 32nd Commander of United Nations Command. He relinquished command last December, and prior to that, he had commanded the 18th Airborne Corps as well as the 4th Infantry Division, and I'm proud to call him my former next-door neighbor. Over to you, General LaCamera.
Thanks, Bill. Nothing ruins a good war story like an eyewitness, and recognizing that my fellow panel members have been there also, and General Brooks remembers me when I was Major and Lieutenant Colonel, and times have changed, because when I first served with General Brooks over there, I was at Camp Greaves north of the Incheon River, just south of the DMZ, and got to listen to the North Korean propaganda music every night walking home. That changed when I went back 4 years ago, which we don't own that anywhere anymore. It's just the joint security area that has both the U.S. Now it's a combined battalion and whatnot. But it's an honor to be here. I'd like to thank Amanda and Steve for all, one, for setting this up, what you do every day to keep this alive and the dialogue. History is instructive, not a blueprint. Fascinating discussion on the history of this. But if you think about where we are today, we're at an inflection point in history, right? You think, I shouldn't do public math as an infantryman, but 1947 National Security Act, about roughly 40 years later, we have the Goldwater-Nichols Act, and here we are about 40 years later, and the fight is going to be combined. It's going to be joint, so Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, Space Force, U.S. side, combined, ROC, U.S., United Nations Command in some form or fashion. And one of the things I did while we were there with Bill's help was we updated the operational plan. It's going to be interagency. One of the things we learned over the last 20 plus years of fighting the global war on terrorism and what we see today is the interagency plays a role, and it's going to be multi-domain. So from the bottom of the sea all the way up to space, and all the different domains, to include the information domain, which we see every single day. So one of the things that we changed, modified, when you think of the elements of national power being diplomatic, information, military, and economic, we added intelligence, law enforcement, technology, because of the great things of when you think of one of the great successes of the Republic of Korea. We talked about K-pop, but K-drama, K-food, but also their technological leaps that they've made and the role that they play. And how do we leverage all of that? And then what is the United Nations Command role? And what hasn't been talked about is when you throw in the neutral nation supervisory committee, where you now have Switzerland and Sweden now grading your homework, and unfortunately there's no, because Poland is now part of NATO and Czechoslovakia is no longer a part, there's nothing on the North Korean side. And the big challenge that we had, that I went through with changes in presidents there was a comprehensive military agreement which restricted some of our activities to include disarming inside the joint security area. That was General Abrams' decision to make. And one of the decisions I had to go through was, do we rearm when the comprehensive military agreement was tossed out? The other one, most recently, was, as KJU was talked about previously, as he started to solidify his border, and what did that mean? And the different incursions that would occur. We had the same challenges with the fishing vessels, defection, but the bigger ones were, as they were remarking their borders, second lieutenant crossing the border, and then, immediately breaking contact when warning shots are fired. And so the complexity of what you're dealing with, and then the authorities that we're really relying on the Republic of Korea forces that are up there along the demilitarized zone, and as has been talked about, this balancing that with the sovereignty of the Republic of Korea, which, as we all know, that is extremely important for all nations. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, General LaCamera. So for about the next 20 to 25 minutes, I'm going to ask a series of moderator-led questions to these gentlemen and give them a chance to respond. But then when we're complete with that, I do want to leave question time for those of you in the audience. And as all of you saw during the break, they are setting up the reception, so we're not going to go over time here, all right? So I'm going to start out with going first to General Brooks, and then General Scaparrotti, and then General LaCamera on this. You've all held a wide variety of unique Army and joint positions and commands. What do you think is sort of the most unique aspect of the United Nations Command compared to other assignments that you've had? General Brooks, over to you.
There are unique authorities that are associated with the United Nations Command. The fact that it is a multinational command established by a United Nations security resolution with authority then given to the United States to organize the command makes it a unified command. So very much like the geographic commands that the United States has in Europe or in the Middle East or in the Indo-Pacific. But its structure goes directly to the Joint Staff. And so it doesn't move it doesn't have an intermediate step through Indo-Pacific Command, for example. Because its authority is vested in the Armistice Agreement also, its authority becomes limited. And yet, its geography is much bigger than the demilitarized zone and the waters that are off the coast that are also contested. It also goes to Japan, to those 7 bases that I alluded to a bit earlier. So it's unique in that it has responsibilities that are not entirely defined geographically, but more defined functionally and operationally. It also is difficult because you don't know who's on your team until such time as they show up. So what the United Nations Command looked like in 1950 to 1953, with 17 different nations sending forces, and the United States and South Korea carrying the preponderance of the forces between the two of them, that's not what it looks like right now. And while there are pieces left of some of the countries, if something were to happen now, who would decide they want to come and support South Korea? And it might be a completely different configuration. So this idea of having the need to remain ready for contingencies and yet not having a force that you can exercise in its entirety with a limited staff is a complex challenge, to be sure. And then also tying to that, the recognition of how that command relates to the others is very important. I found it critically important to understand the authorities and understand the relationships so that I didn't commingle them. Because the authority I have to say no to South Korea on something coming into the demilitarized zone, I can only do that as a UN commander. I don't get to do that as the U.S. Forces commander or the Combined Forces commander, especially during times of armistice. So it's a role that is living but challenged in its configuration, and I found that very different from anything else that I experienced in field command.
Thank you, General Brooks. Over to you.
Sure, I think General Brooks covered it very well. I would have said first it was a UN mandate that established the command. Quite unusual. Secondly, that if you think about it, a command like this, a multinational command, that's existed for 75 years and has done its job. It's been able to adapt and do its job throughout all that time and still be in existence today. I mean, other than NATO, there's not a like command that has survived those years and yet is effective at doing what it was set out to do and had done so for those 75 years. I think that's significant as well. If you think about it, the UN command, UNC, when it was established in 1950, I think it's the only UN command or organization that was given a combat role as well. After that, it was changed. As we had it, it was to maintain the armistice. But when it was established, it was established to conduct combat if necessary. Later, UN military organizations are large. They are peacekeeping, they're neutral, and they don't have a combat role as well. So that one started that way. It was able to adapt. It was able to change. And as a commander, the authorities at General Brooks, I think, are the other thing that stood out. It was an unusual one in that you had to be sure about which one of my roles I was speaking in, but it gave you authority to say no to Republic of Korea's positioning of troops or specific training if it was directly related to maintaining the armistice and peace in the DMZ, et cetera. And that's a pretty unique set of authorities compared to anything else that I had done, to include leading multinational forces in Afghanistan or later in NATO, for instance.
Thank you, General Scaparrotti. Over to you, General LaCamera.
Yeah, I'll just reinforce the gentleman's position on this. I mean, the good news is the current uniform has a Velcro patch, and you could change patches. So you had to, we always talk about, hey, what hat are we wearing, right? And so the hats are all the same, but the patches change. And the staff had to quickly adapt to, okay, when I change that's the position I was talking to, from an overt position. And the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, and we would joke about it because in a way you're a little bit bipolar because you're arguing, both sides of the, hey, we got to reduce tension down to, get back to the armistice. At the same time, you don't want to, be caught flat-footed, tackle flat-footed here if something were to happen. And be able to balance that as a commander, and then more importantly, the staff of, okay, making sure that they understand, because it's authorities and approvals for you to be able to do something. You have to have the authority to do it, and then you have to be, you obviously want the approval authority left at your level. But that becomes the challenge. And then what is the United Nations command if hostilities, start over again? Because it has, as General Scaparrotti said, the mission has transitioned and transformed and whatnot as things change. And how do you balance that is the bigger issue. And then you throw in the different countries, and then you have the sending states, or now member states, but you also then have other third country nationals that are there. This is unlike 1950, when you look at the tremendous growth of the Republic of Korea and what are those responsibilities, because those countries, while they may not be part of the United Nations Command, they do have a bilateral relationship, and how does that then impact, getting back to armistice, and how do you balance that, and how do you keep people informed as you go forward?
Thanks, General LaCamera. So I'm going to sort of take what they've sort of said in their opening comments, and then go to General Scaparrotti, General LaCamera, and General Brooks, and ask you specifically, how does the United Nations Command assist in deterring future conflict on the Korean Peninsula? First to you, General Scaparrotti.
Well, interestingly enough, it's, when you think of deterrence, you think of force projection, but UN Command, it isn't about force projection or forces for that matter. It's actually about legal authority. It's about the multinational authority it comes, and it's about the authorities within crisis management. But they are important, and I found them to be very important in deterrence as well. The UN Command has the authority to investigate and adjudicate violations of the armistice itself. You have member states, 18 today. They, as multinational partners, all committed, literally committed to peace on the peninsula, and also committed to defense of South Korea. So in and of itself, that multinational grouping, through diplomatic and informational exercises, et cetera, operations, have a deterrent effect as well. And then finally, there's a communications piece of this, that the UN Command is often the only one that has the linkage immediately. And it's that communication that's important in deterrence. You can have capability and will, but you have to have a means to communicate to the other side as well. And that's provided through UN. I think all of those things play a role in deterrence.
Thanks, General Scaparrotti. General LaCamera.
Yeah, to build on something General Brooks said earlier, what for me as the United Nations commander, what it allowed me to do is I could touch all the other U.S. combatant commands. My focal length changed as the UN commander because of the threat that DPRK, with its capabilities, possessed, or provided not just to the Pen or the region, but globally. And making sure as we engage with ambassadors and other things like that to be able to talk to them about that threat, what it meant again to their citizens that were there. The other pieces and parts of that are the Republic of Korea military is not just operating in that area, they're operating outside, and so working through those other countries, I had no issue with them training off the Pen because I got a better product back, because interoperability, if there's one thing that we've learned in the last 30 years of fighting in coalitions, are that you have to be able to interoperate. And does it have to be with the U.S. forces? No. But like-minded countries with the similar capabilities on an exercise someplace else, sharing tactics, techniques, and procedures and whatnot, lessons learned coming off the other battlefields of the world, would then allow us to bring that back in. More helping my CFC hat, my Combined Forces Commander hat, or U.S. Forces Korea hat, but really working towards making sure that we maintain the armistice, peace through strength. And because readiness is perishable, and there's turnover on both on the U.S. and on the ROK side, how do we make sure that we're keeping the lessons off the battlefield fresh, and then strength and readiness being that ultimate deterrence going forward. So being able to work hand in glove with my other commands, with the other commands, I think helped in that deterrence role.
Thanks, General LaCamera. General Brooks.
It's interesting, the deterrence comes in several forms, but from the UN command perspective, I'd say there are three main contributions to deterrence. The execution of its actual mission of preserving the armistice deters a resumption of hostilities. Remember, the Korean Peninsula is not in a condition of peace. It's a cessation of hostilities. And the fact that there's a body there that is constantly looking and managing and keeping forces separated contributes to the deterrence from resumption of especially conventional activity. The second is there's a force in being. And so there's a shared destiny with anything that resumes. The countries that are involved in UN Command, especially the United States and the Republic of Korea, would find themselves in the midst of it. And so there's a commitment already, and that has a deterrent effect, that if something were to resume, all those countries would likely respond to the aid of their people. And the third is this extended reach that comes from UN Command in the presence forward, the representation of other countries, and the reach that goes back into those capitals, and also their bases in Japan. And I keep coming back to that because it's important to understand that projection structure that comes from Japan is critically important. It's also used by the United States and by Japan on a day-to-day basis. But those 7 bases will be very, very important. And what that leads to then is the nations who are involved pay attention to what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. They don't get to change the channel on that because they have people involved. And that leads to things like the Vancouver dialogue that occurred in January of 2018, really an outgrowth of the discussions that each of us have had with the ambassadors who are representing those countries in Seoul. We would meet with them on a recurring basis. That idea then went to national level during a time of tension in 2017, and the nations that came to meet in Vancouver, hosted by Canada, invited by the United States, all of them were United Nations Command states except for one, that was India. And so there's a reach that comes from United Nations Command into the global environment that also contributes to deterrence, in my view.
Thank you, General Brooks. So all 3 of these gentlemen have mentioned a lot of the unique organizations and actors within the region. So there's United States Indo-Pacific Command, there's U.S. Forces Japan, you have the Republic of Korea Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is responsible right now for the day-to-day sort of security of the Republic of Korea. There's the Combined Forces Command, which is the Korean ROK and U.S. Warfighting Command. And so I really want to come first to General LaCamera and General Brooks and ask them specifically, how does the UNC complement, or what is the unique thing that UNC brings that none of these other organizations do? And then at the very end, I want to come to General Scaparrotti and just say, based on your experience, sir, in NATO, do you have any reflections on the uniqueness of United Nations Command? So first, to General LaCamera.
What I think it brings in the exercise, sometimes to the bane of my staff's existence, was asking the hard questions about, combat power. If you think in a fight, it's going to be the 4-block war: offensive operations, defensive operations, stability operations, defense support to civilian agencies in the country there. And then the first thing that's going to happen is going to be a non-combatant evacuation. And what does that mean? And starting, as you got warfighters who are focused, solely on, going forward and defense, no, you have to think of those other 4. It's, nobody pays to see the one-ball juggler. So you're going to have to do multiple tasks, and you have to dedicate resources to those tasks. And we would constantly do that. And then I think what was brought up before is, what is, you have the United Nations Command 1950. You had the sending states. Now they're called member states. They were categorized by, combat forces, combat support forces. But the reality of it is, we're going to need support. We're going to need resources to be able, it's going to be a very resource-intensive fight. And my comment was always, I would take, one person, with the flag, and some resources, because that gives you international legitimacy and strategic depth when dealing with trying to solve this problem. And so by interjecting those into the exercises and whatnot, it forced all sides to contribute, to just sit here and say, hey, you got to go away. No, these are problems, these are friction points that have to be addressed, because they're going to be a distractor. At least that's been my experience on deployments, that you just can't, wish it away. Now there is risk, and you have to decide how much do you put in there. But I think, in a way, our last 20 plus years of fighting in the Middle East, the old comment that Napoleon made, right? Rookies talked tactics, professionals talk logistics. That kind of went away, and we really started focusing on intelligence only as the number one. to driver. But in large-scale combat operations, especially on the Korean Peninsula, all the warfighting, I mean, sustainment, our ability to generate and regenerate combat power is going to be extremely difficult. A combined joint forcible entry operation in today's multi-domain environment is going to be extremely difficult because of what our adversaries can see on a day-to-day basis. And so it's not as simple as I'm not trying to wish away what they did, but today's environment is much more different, and making sure that people understood that and that we have all the capabilities that we need. Focus on capabilities, not numbers. Numbers are great. Sometimes they equal capabilities, but it is capabilities in all the warfighting functions that are extremely important. I would not get hung up on numbers, because numbers and capability are not necessarily the exact same thing.
Thank you. Over to you, General Brooks.
The speed of action in current military practice is very different than it was in 1950. So things happen very, very quickly. Assembling a coalition for an operation is very, very difficult work. Maintaining one is also very difficult. When you're in the middle of a fight and it's unfolding quickly, addressing the needs of the fight and also being able to build what comes next is a challenging undertaking. In this particular case, UN Command helps the Combined Forces Command, which is the warfighter since 1978. It took the warfighting function away from UN Command and created a US and South Korea standing command that fights if there is a need to fight. And the US forces, who are then responsible for providing US capability into that fight. But what about everybody else? So if someone comes from another country, any one of those original sending states, or version 2.0, as I sometimes used to call it, which is whatever comes next in a time of need, who's putting them into the right relationship with the Combined Forces Command? Who's coordinating their access to the country? Who's coordinating their movement from their home station in? You could say, well, it's just them, but not everybody has C-17s and can fly them in. So all that reach back becomes a need to communicate to the international community of how you build a force and then put it into a rational relationship with the warfighting command. You can't just hand them off and say, okay, they're here. Every country sends forces with something called a national caveat, or national caveats, plural. We will do these things, but we will not do that thing. We will be involved in supporting, but we will not cross into what was North Korea. We will provide logistic support, but we will not engage in regime collapse or regime change. These are caveats that are submitted by each country, and it's their prerogative. It's a condition that's associated with their sending of troops. And someone must manage that. And I can tell you, as the warfighting headquarters, you need to have that sorted out and the right instrument handed to you. If you need a hammer, it needs to be a hammer put in your hand. If you need to have a crosscut saw put in your hand, it needs to be a crosscut saw that's ready for action. And that's what these contributions from the international community look like. They have to be configured for the use of the warfighting command and not make that a problem coming out. So that's what UN Command really does uniquely, is build a structure around it in support of it. Oh, by the way, we're talking about kind of the warfighting track, but it could also end up where you've got peace breaking out all over. That is a possibility. It's not on the horizon right now, but that has always been the aim. The armistice agreement was a temporary measure until a real peace could be concluded diplomatically. All right, it's a military relationship. But how do you get to that, and what do you do when it comes? So everything from establishing confidence-building measures, demilitarizing, disarming, inspecting, all those things tend to require a multinational approach, and often the United Nations is involved in that. UN Command is a in-place command to do that, at least to create an option for international leaders that you have something that is already a structure that has those types of authorities and can do that work. Those are unique capabilities that UN Command brings.
Thank you, sir. General Scott.
Well, I think I'd go right back to General Brooks and say that, as a commander, that experience, particularly with the ambassadors, the diplomats that represented the countries within the UNC command. That experience for me in Korea was extremely valuable as I went to NATO next. NATO has a mission to defend the transatlantic. But what I found there was that I also had to engage with all the countries of NATO, with their policymakers, their foreign ministers, their ministers of defense, et cetera, to understand policy, understand what's available, to understand their interests and what they would or would not do. Anything that I wanted to do on the military side as the SAC-EUR, I had to set those conditions first and ensure that I understood it. And so the experience in the UN command, in that relationship, was invaluable in NATO as well. Now, those countries were oriented on defending not only the transatlantic, but their nation, which was a part of that. In Korea, at the time I was there, 16 nations had interests there in peace in the peninsula, but it was Korea and its country that they were there to protect.
Thank you, sir. So they talked a little bit about member states and participation of member states. And as they did that, I was recalling the United Nations Cemetery in Busan. I believe it's the only United Nations cemetery that exists. And down there, all the sending states are represented with some form of monument or memorial listing by name those people from their countries that perished in the Korean War. And then there's a small number that are actually buried there, to include Americans in the United Nations Cemetery. But gentlemen, I wanted to ask, and I'll just really just go to probably to General Brooks and General LaCamera on this as we transition sort of towards the end of our framed questions. What opportunities do you think there are for increasing member state participations, and what are the challenges to joining? First to General Brooks.
Well, the first is articulating the role of United Nations Command and why their national interests can be served by United Nations Command. It's all about national interest for every country to decide how they participate or if they will or not. When you take someone to that great cemetery and you remind them of the international contribution, or you walk into the United Nations Command headquarters and you see all the flags, you see flags behind us here that represent some of those 17 states. It tells you that it takes an international community to stem the tide of invasion, in this particular case of South Korea by North Korea, but also to preserve peace or to pursue peace, which is what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. It hasn't happened yet. This is a continuous undertaking that has to be communicated to countries, and they have to express their interest in it. Simplifying the process would be needed to do that. It's not an easy thing to do because of the concerns that each country would have, and especially and primarily South Korea being the nation that would be the host, the beneficiary, the recipient of these things. Their sovereignty has to be addressed. One of the biggest challenges and how it might be expanded, my personal view would be you must start with Japan. And that is a controversial position for me to take, and I acknowledge that. Just because of the long history between Japan and South Korea makes that difficult to enable. But 7 bases are in Japan. And Japan has long committed to the support of the defense on the Korean Peninsula since 1952 when it got its sovereignty back. They've agreed ever since then to do that. There is a headquarters element in Japan at Yokota Air Base for United Nations Command. We call it UNC Rear. They should have something to say about that. And I'm not suggesting that there needs to be a flood of Japanese troops that are operating in Korea. That doesn't have to be the case, and it's not what Japan would be asking for. But to have a say in what happens, at least in UN Command Rear, is equal to the kind of access we make sure that Korea has on what occurs in UN Command in the Republic of Korea. So that would be the first step, and it's a challenging one to be sure, but one that is worth working on at national levels. This is not a military problem. This is a national political problem, and it has to be done by national level leaders. And there's a good chance that may be able to progress with the strong relationship that has already started between the Republic of Korea and Japan. I'm hopeful that that will be a step. There have been some that have been added, and Paul might want to talk about that, but there have been some that have been added since my departure from command, and that was success. Enticing them, explaining the reasons for it, enabling them, and then overcoming those frictions that might make it very difficult. That's what it takes to expand and improve United Nations Command.
Thank you, sir.
We did. We did have success. It started with General Abrams, and again, because of the diplomatic and at the political level, that's where the decisions are made. But we were finally able to get a country added, Germany, and others approached me, and we did come up with a system and the steps that they would come. It wasn't as easy as me saying yes, and then obviously making sure that we were communicating properly to the South Korean government that their sovereignty, they get a vote on this, and making sure that things weren't leaked going forward, and that we were getting out ahead of ourselves. And so that process does exist. And it continually gets refined, and I had other countries approach me. But then there was, at the political level, the diplomatic level, many conversations with the State Department, specifically the ambassador. Is it the time to bring this country in, or what are the other things that are playing in? And then my recommendation would go back into the Pentagon for them to make that decision, and then work with the Republic of Korea government. So those do exist. They do have bilateral relationships. Again, we've talked a little bit about that. You know, there's a potential that you're going to have on the battlefield or in a crisis. You know, the Combined Forces Command, U.S. Forces Korea, United Nations Command, and then bilateral other troops. And again, making sure that we are working that. And as General, and we know where that is, as the Combined Forces Commander, making sure I know, okay, who is in that piece of ground, and what are we doing, and how are we protecting it? And again, there are 2 million third country nationals from 32 different countries. 950,000 of them are from the PRC. So that creates a challenge of how do we work this. It is at the diplomatic level. The sovereignty of the Republic of Korea is absolutely sacrosanct, and we have to work that. I tell junior officers who want to basically transition tactical, operational, strategic, political in a day. If you want that challenge, come to U.S. Forces Korea or United Nations Command, CFC, because you're going to deal with that and that impact on the day-to-day operations of what you're going through. But there are other things that are ongoing that the policymakers, get a vote in on how we go forward. Ours is to provide those options.
Thank you, General LaCamera. Before we go to the audience question and answer, I want to do one final question that I'll present to all three, starting with General Scaparrotti, then General Brooks, and General LaCamera. All of you mentioned from your experience different aspects of things that you had to deal with as it related to enforcing the armistice agreement. Are there other things that you think we ought to be thinking about that are challenges or things that you experience, and what does it mean to the future? Over to you, General Scaparrotti.
Well, in my view, I think it's things that we are actually thinking about now that are important. Today's security environment, and we're talking about it in the region of the peninsula, but today's security environment is connected. It's global. There's nothing that's going to stay in one place. And what's changed in the last couple of years is that now you have a solidifying relationship in support of each other between Russia, North Korea, China in particular. So any action for any of those countries automatically expands this problem set that you've got. So I think that's something we keep in mind, and because of that, Bill, I think that beyond the UN command, it gives you that opportunity to reach out to other countries. Within the UN command of 18 nations, I think 12 are NATO, 10 are European, for instance. And they are absolutely interested and understand this connectivity. I go to the Pacific often to the Shangri-La Security Dialogue. Over the last 3 years, there's been an increasing number of European senior leaders there because they know that this is connected, Europe and the Indo-Pacific. So I think that that framework, that platform that the UN gives in connection with other networks that we have in the Pacific are very important, and Europe as well.
Thank you, sir. John Brooks.
I believe that the ability to sense what is next is critically important to be able to respond in time. And sensing what is next often runs against the pressures of the present. And so I think that in this particular case, for UN Command, is what is next? What is coming next? Is conflict coming next, and how do you prepare for that? Is there a role for UN Command in it? Is the transfer of operational control of forces in wartime coming next between the U.S. and South Korea? Is there a role for UN Command in it? It certainly doesn't impede that in any way, but can enable it if it's thought through very, very well. Is dialogue coming next, and potentially a road to peace? And if so, what is the role of UN Command in that? My biggest concern on this is there's really not a structure above UN Command to think like that, to think about the what's next and ensure that there are configurations, there are policies, there are instructions that can respond in real time and are anticipating next. And that perhaps is another area of, we use the term revitalization, and there's some baggage associated with that term, but in this idea of making the UN Command even more useful and even more relevant for what's coming in the future, calls for a little bit of a renovation in the structure that is above UN Command, fleshing that out to make it very, very clear and who the players are in that. And that's currently missing. So I would have a concern about that and hope that can be addressed.
General LaCamera.
Yeah, I'd reinforce that. I mean, we can't have a failure of imagination of what could happen next. I said it at the beginning, history is instructive. It's not a blueprint. And what is our ability to react in a crisis? Who are we talking to? How are we solving these? If OPCON transition occurs, what does that mean? If people want to come in, and having done coalition warfare in other theaters, they come with the national caveats on who they're going to work for and how they're going to work and what they're going to do, and can we make that work? And I just think when you start thinking about the people, the adversaries in the region, when Putin visited DPRK, he stayed over his entire country until he crossed the border. I mean, he has interior lines with PRC, he being KJU, and in Russia. I mean, that creates challenges, and then the distances that we have to travel, and how do we leverage the United Nations Command? How do we leverage those other combatant commands on the U.S. side, to work to create that strategic depth and that international legitimacy of the things that we're doing? And how do we do this? How do we war game without scaring people, for lack of a better term? Because military, we like to plan, right? We don't want to be caught short on it. And having those plans and having the intellectual curiosity to be able to war game and the what ifs, and not have that failure of imagination, and look at different courses of action and take the subjective emotions out of it. This is a very emotional topic when you start talking about, I think someone brought up the reunification word earlier. In the 3.5 years that I was there, in the different discussions that I had with, honest discussions with deputies of what does that term mean, that's not going to be defined by us. That's going to be defined by the Korean people and what end state is. And we have a hard time defining what end state is sometimes. And but we've got to look at that. What does that look like? And then can we have that conversation? obviously behind closed doors so that we're not spooking the herd, but we got to be thinking about that because things can happen very, very quickly. And what does that mean? And, at the risk of Clausewitz on war, right? I used to think it was a duel, and then I recognized that you had to read paragraph 2, which I did. But it's an extension of politics, and so end state that can move, and sometimes we don't recognize that. And then to quote another old dead guy, know the enemy, know yourself, you'll never be defeated. We really have to have some honest conversations of knowing ourselves, knowing the adversaries that push against what's going on, and then fully recognizing that in today's, as General Scaparrotti talked about, large-scale combat operations, we're not getting out of it unscathed. It will be, there will be a lot of death and destruction that we have to think our way through that, especially on the Korean Peninsula, given the great successes that country has endured. And it's not just confined, in my mind, to the pen. How do you break up a coalition? You attack others to get after it. And so I think there's a lot at stake, and we need to be prepared to have those honest conversations. I'm not saying that we're not. I'm just saying that, as we go through this, I know it's being done on the military side behind closed doors, thinking it through.
Okay, thank you, sir. So let's open it up to the audience now for question and answer. And what I'll do is he'll bring you the mic. You answer your question. I'll repeat it just for clarity. And then if you have it for anybody in specific, give it to them or I'll hand it off. Let's go ahead.
Gentlemen, I appreciate all your insights. As a Marine Corps retiree, spent a lot of time over in Korea, so definitely appreciate all the leadership over the years that you provided there. General Brooks, you mentioned a bit about operational control, transfer of a potential in the future. I know that the current Lee administration has stated that within the next 5 years that they would want to have that transfer of OPCON, in the event that it comes to a wartime situation, within the time frame of the current administration. And then one of the things that was discussed earlier today was that the kind of the state of operational readiness when it comes to the Republic of Korea military, because of the fact that the population or the forces, right, have dwindled over the years, is because of the again, the low birth rates and other factors that come into play. And I know, General Brooks, you did state that again, there's a lot of factors there. And also, General, you also mentioned about the scale of wartime operations, of how complex and how significant that would be. So given everything that I've just stated, it's a two-part question then. The first question being, is the Lee administration not being realistic with the current state of their readiness of their military? And two, just want to hear your perspectives of, as far as what you think that would look like as far as an operation control transfer.
So I think you're asking about readiness and operational control. And we'll give that to General Brooks. Okay. And then
I'll take a swing at it, and everyone else can take a shot as well. This idea of the transfer of operational control of forces in wartime, which is the long name for it, you'll hear it called OPCON transition, OPCON transfer, is about who gives the instructions to people in a time of war. All right. There is a plan that has been created by the two countries on how to set the conditions that would make that possible to transfer it from a U.S. lead to a South Korean lead. Whenever I hear a timeline added to it, I feel like we're going backwards. There have been timelines before. The fastest way to get to a transfer operation control decision is to meet the conditions that are associated with this preparation. So if 5 years is the object, then let's get the conditions met within the next 3 to 4. And then we have a chance to meet that 5-year timeline. But if you pick a timeline because you want it during your watch, the conditions may not be met by then. And then everything that's associated with that is weaker when it comes to execution. Certainly can be done. National level leaders can make a decision to do that tonight. But if you want the conditions to be right so that there's less of a chance of failure for the alliance when put to the test, like in a conflict with North Korea, there's a reason why those conditions are in place. And those can be discussed. They're reviewed continuously throughout a year cycle and elevated to higher levels every single year. So there's more than ample opportunity to make adjustments if those conditions are viewed to be, this one's no longer relevant, or we want to advance in other areas. Now, related to your question about the size of South Korea's military, and Bruce Bennett talked about that a bit earlier, indeed, they are shrinking for the reasons he described. Certainly, President Lee Jae-myung, President Lee has expressed in his recent summit with President Trump that there's a desire to have a more technologically advanced South Korean military, and that will help. But technology, we're all infantry, so I'm inclined to say that's not enough. So you have to train harder to fight outnumbered and win. It means you train longer, you train all season, you train day and night, which is what the U.S. forces do. South Korean forces do also, but to a lesser degree. So as they shrink to regain advantage, their edge must be sharper than it has ever been. And the technology can then enhance that sharp-edged instrument, which would be the South Korean armed forces. Their mobilization process is very important. There is a large number to be mobilized, but there's a much larger number in North Korea to be mobilized. And that creates a different condition of disadvantage. What systems are used to defeat where North Korea might be able to gain advantage? That's part of the modernization plan. So all these things are tied together. You can't just rush to a conclusion if you're not thinking about all the other pieces associated therewith, lest you create a significant vulnerability and weakness that will be exploited by North Korea by itself or North Korea with friends in the case that something like that might happen.
Thank you, sir. General LaCamera, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think to your last point, I think we forget that we're not the only country that has allies, partners, and friends. I might go back to my previous comment about large-scale combat operations. There's never been a knockout punch in warfare. And so we have to, because of the turnover, both on the U.S. side and the ROK side, what level of training, we have to be ruthless. Readiness is perishable, and so focusing on the basics. And Colonel Puckett, who recently passed away, Medal of Honor winner for both the U.S. and the Republic of Korea, taught me as a young Ranger company commander that, combat is simple, blocking and tackling. Focusing on the basics, being able to do it over and over and over again. And I go back to my previous comment about it's not just the maneuver element, it's the fires, it's sustainment. Can we generate and regenerate combat power properly? We sometimes forget about that, and the time it's going to take for us to mobilize on both sides. Meanwhile, while dealing with a non-combatant evacuation, meanwhile, while dealing with casualties, meanwhile, we're dealing with all these other things in all domains, right? In the information domain where, gaslighting will be a priority, disinformation that's out there, the cyber, and the threats that it presents to us. When you think about, even just our ability to get across the Western Pacific, of what that would take to build up, and how do you protect those lines of communication, and just given the capabilities that are, so it's just something that we have to continually go after. It's a standards-based, conditions-based decision, I think, but politics being politics, if the decision's made, I think the job of the military is to come back and say, this is the risk that's created in doing that. And as resources get shifted around, we just need to make sure that we fully understand it. And then when you think of the capabilities, the civilian capabilities or the growth inside of the Republic of Korea, I think what jumped out to me coming back after I was there was the training range operations, the capabilities there, and our ability to train properly at the right level. And technology will get us some places, but it won't take away our ability to do combined arms maneuver in a combined and multi-domain. So maybe that's done on the Korean Peninsula, maybe it's done in exercises as elsewhere. And then realizing that once you get to a certain level, there's going to be turnover, and then how do you bring that in? And how do we have decision makers that get that training? How does artificial intelligence, machine learning help us with that? Because we have a lot of experience now, but as we get further and further away from combat experience, how do we replicate that for decision makers? And I would say not just on the uniform side, but on the civilian side, because we're going to need, again, I go back to authorities and approvals, we're going to need, because of the speed of war, decision makers that are switched on and can make those decisions quickly.
Thank you, sir. How about let's take one here, and then we'll move to the center, and then if anybody's got it over here, and I think that'll probably wrap us up. So one here, and then center, we'll arm wrestle, and then we'll come over to this side.
Good. Well, gentlemen, let me reiterate again what a privilege it is to have the four of you on this stage today. Like you, I served in Korea in the 2nd Infantry Division in the early 1980s. I was very proud of that service. I'm very proud of what that did for our allies in Korea. But I'm increasingly concerned, given what I'm hearing coming out of Washington right now, about the strength of our relationship with our ally in South Korea. And candidate Trump in 2016 indicated that he had no problems with the Republic of Korea or Japan acquiring nuclear weapons as a counterpoint to the North Koreans. So given where we are today, if we further decrease our presence as American forces on the peninsula, do you see the nuclearization of those two countries as being a follow-on?
So I think you're really asking, some of this is a policy level question, which I know the panel members will steer away from. But anything that any of you would suggest to contribute to his question?
Well, the only thing I would say is that having listened to President Lee in the summit he just had, they stated that Korea will be a part of the non-proliferation treaty. They'll remain that. It sounded to me like he's committed to that much as we are, and I'm confident of extended deterrence. I happen to believe that there's less benefit to have South Korea nuclearized than there is the other way around, in fact, for not only the defense of Korea, but for the broader global perspective as well. I think in terms of our troop posture and the flexibility or whether it's going to come down, I personally just think let's see. I've heard from the summit as well there, both on both sides, what I thought was a pragmatic message. And we're committed to ensure the defense of South Korea. So flexibility has been something, even when I was in command, we discussed flexibility with South Korea and the use of our troops. So I don't know the outcome yet. I'm not going to project it, but I'm positive about it, having heard what I heard come out of the summit.
Thank you, sir. Okay,
We
question.
spent a lot of time focused on the extended deterrence piece and again the policy piece. But again, I go back to numbers and capabilities. I mean, since I was a second lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne Division, I've been looking at and serving in other rapid deployment forces. The Republic of Korea has always been on the radar. So just because they're there doesn't mean you can't get there. So I think I call it three-card monte. What's on the pen, what's not, how quickly can we get there? What does extended deterrence mean? What is the assurance to the Republic of Korea, the people of the Republic of Korea? But I think what has to remain a top priority is the forces that are there must be able to train and maintain readiness. The greatest crime that any commander can commit is to commit untrained, unready service members into battle. And if it can't be done there, for whatever reason, then we have to figure it out. And that becomes risk, and that becomes a conversation between currently General Brunson and the Indo-PACOM commander and the people in the Pentagon. But again, I get away from what's sitting on the pen doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have that tool in our kit bag that General Brooks talked about. Commitments from other countries. Again, that's where the United Nations Command can come in of, there's a carrier, so-and-so, blah, blah, that can be used, and how do we exercise that? The world is getting smaller, it's more connected, and our ability to hide in plain sight is going to become more of a challenge, and having a capability that can be targeted, how long will you keep that capability? I think is something that has to be seriously considered going forward. Tip of the iceberg, for lack of a better term. What's below can be concealed, and it might not just be on the pen.
Okay, thank you, sir. I think we got time for maybe 2 short questions. I'll go all the way to the back row first.
Thank you. I was drawn to the comparison between North and South Korea and North and South Vietnam. And the outcomes of the 2 countries vastly different. Can you expound on what you think may have been one cause versus another, the way that things turned out? Vietnam, is like nobody wanted us there. South Korea, everybody wants us there.
Okay, so compare or contrast the difference between the 2 in 2 or 3 minutes. So I'm going to, General Brooks, you want to take that one first?
Well, yeah, certainly. In my experience as the commander of U.S. Army Pacific, I had the occasion to be in both Vietnam and in South Korea, and then command in South Korea thereafter. The big difference is 70 years, more than 70 years, of continuous presence of the United States in the Republic of Korea. That makes a difference. It made a difference to create an insulated structure within which South Korea could develop itself, which it did. Now it's a world leader in multiple areas. It's one of the largest economies in the world. It has technologies that all of us benefit from in our hands and in our pockets at this very moment. North Korea didn't get that kind of help. And it makes me always keep in mind that the way out of this may not be a presumption that China is always going to back up North Korea, because China has candidly left North Korea a basket case in the same period of time. Just the population changes that have occurred. North Korea used to be the bigger of the 2 twins, if you will. Not now. The entire population of North Korea is less than that of the city of Seoul. This is a stunted growth condition, and they've been left that way by their friends. The Republic of Korea was not left that way because they have real friends. That's the big difference. And when you take the Vietnam comparison, it really is a different dynamic altogether. It didn't come from a presence, then an invasion. U.S. forces and South Korean forces, I would add, were introduced into that while it was already an ongoing war. The war changed when we were introduced, and the outcome was less than desirable, but in the long period of time, we now have normal diplomatic relations with Vietnam. Vietnam does stand against some of the pressures from the People's Republic of China. Vietnam has an expanding infrastructure and growth that's been ongoing now. In many ways, we won at great cost. But we didn't have it through a continuous presence, and that's the big difference between one environment and another.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to want to come to this side real quick. The 3 of you can arm wrestle. Ma'am, I'm going to you in the back. Go ahead.
I don't know, you can probably hear me. I don't think I
No,
I'm sorry, I'll whisper because we're quiet. So, thank you very much for having us. This is wonderful, and thank you for the panel and allowing us to ask questions. So I'm coming from a way different generation, well, a little bit different generation. And so my question is to the entire panel. So safety's first, right? And we have all these technological things as you've spoken to. What is the purpose of keeping boots on the ground as extensively as we are, since so much money and personnel are dwindling, not just from our country, but from other countries. And obviously we have to be present in different parts of the world more than we used to have to be. So what are your thoughts on continuing? I know the UNC is an important thing. It's a wonderful organization, but where are we going with that? 70 years is a long time to be staying there. Are we going to let them try to conflict themselves out of it, or are we just going to always be, because I seem to think that we are the overall dominating group from the America, and they see us as almost oppressing them now.
Okay, so how about we do this? Because we're moving sort of towards the wrap-up. What I'd like to do is sort of give it to each one of them sequentially, and as part of their sort of concluding remarks, they can talk about how they see the role of not just the UN command, but the role, what U.S. forces do there for regional security. So, gentlemen, this will sort of be your wrap-up, a few minutes each.
Well, first of all, the troops that we have in Korea, working with South Korea, provide capabilities that work together. That's how we decide what's there, so that we have an effective fighting force, we have the readiness we need. And I would say to you that even if peace broke out tomorrow on the peninsula, all right, we would keep our troops there. We would keep a U.S. presence there because of its strategic location and the importance of that. The second thing in my wrap-up is, again, to say that what's important in today's world, I believe, readiness first, but second is who are your allies and how do you maintain those allies? How do you keep them close? How do you ensure interoperability? How do you know that you can work with each other? It's because we're around the world doing just that in places like Korea. If you go back in history, most wars were not decided by the one country. It was decided by that one country and who were their allies and how many did they have. And in today's world, we need our allies. The United States is not strong enough to take on these problems by themselves. So that's my wrap, and I think things like the United Nations Command and others that we have networked around the globe are very important in today's security environment.
Thank you, John.
Having U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula sends a message of commitment. The configuration can change. It has changed significantly since the Korean War and changed multiple times based on what the perceived need is at a given point in time. It's significantly smaller now than it was, say, at the end of the Korean War by a long shot, and even in the midst between those two. It's much smaller than it was. But it sends the same message the whole time. We're still with you. The United States has multiple allies. South Korea has one ally, and it's the United States of America. And so the commitment to them is a very important one. They have the preponderance of forces by a long shot. It's South Korea that is defending the Republic of Korea on a day-to-day basis. But the presence of the United States and its commitment that comes with that presence is what gives deterrence and assurance at the same time. I hearken back to our historical discussions that we had earlier this morning or earlier this afternoon, and sometimes a tendency to say that we really don't need boots on the ground. We can work from over the horizon and use naval and air forces to reinforce South Korea if we need to. We've already seen that movie. Now, certainly South Korea is not the same today in its military capability that it was in 1949, 1950. But there is a signal that comes with departing from a place where you've been committed. And if it's in the condition where there is still danger, it probably is untimely. The Korean Peninsula is not at peace yet. And until it is, we shouldn't be having a conversation about departing.
General LaCamera.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, at the operational level of warfare, fighting your way into the anti-access area of denial vice, fighting from within, will be very costly. And so, because we are still at war, it's an armistice, and our treaty commitment to defending them. So to me, there'd be a lot more risk, and that was the argument that I've made. If we had to fight our way in, would be a lot more costly than starting in and building up.
So I think that's something that has to be looked at. And again, if we were to end it today, there's still a transition because the demilitarized zone is probably the most militarized piece of ground in the face of the earth right now. And so what would UN Command transition to? So I think the either or, the black and white, it's not binary. I think there's multiple avenues here that this thing can go, and having that presence. And again, the world's getting smaller, not larger. And being, I call it a strategic LPOP, listening post, observation post. We're on the Asian street. I mean, we're there every single day. I mean, I made this mistake when I was meeting with the New Zealand Minister of Defense, and I said, well, the sun hits us before it hits, the PRC, and he says, well, it hits us first. And I was like, oh, damn. A victim of the mass public school system. I forgot New Zealand, where the sun was. But I think that's important. It is, and it's not just the Republic of Korea. It's, General Brooks talked about Japan and our responsibilities there in the region. And I think, to build on General Scaparrotti's comment earlier, what starts local will go regional and global quickly. I mean, we learned that with COVID. We've learned that with other things. It's not going to be isolated, and it's a long commute. And having the eyes and ears from a military perspective, I think, is important. From a diplomatic and from an information, and more importantly, an economic. Because, right, the business of America is business. Being there, being on the Asian continent, and being with the Republic of Korea, I think, is extremely important. My only closing comment would be this, that I didn't relay earlier. One of the greatest honors that I had as the UNC commander, and General Brooks mentioned it when the DPRK handed over remains, was that as the UN commander, I got to sign those remains over to both the Republic of Korea and the US. And I made my favorite picture that I moved into the armistice room inside the headquarters, which if you were to go in there, every country is represented with all the names of the fallen. And anytime we get visitors, we'd bring them in there. Pretty powerful when you think about it. But there's a young lieutenant, she is escorting her great-grandfather's remains home. And so our commitment to our fallen and the POWs and MIA is pretty powerful. And that's probably, in all my years, a pretty powerful moment. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you to all our panel members, and thank you for your attention and participation. Amanda, over to you.
Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, gentlemen, for the very thoughtful discussion. General Douglas MacArthur said there is no substitute for victory, and here at the MacArthur Memorial, we like to say there is no substitute for history, which to us means not just the preservation of historical objects and stories, but real inquiry into the past, whether that is 1950 or the 2010s, 2020s. So, gentlemen, that was really very wonderful. So thank you for doing that with us today. As a token of our gratitude, we would like to present each of you with replicas of General MacArthur's Congressional Gold Medal that was authorized in 1962. On that medal is an honorific, one of many, but Defender of Korea. And so we hope you will take those with our deepest gratitude. I'd also like to invite Dr. Bennett and Mr. Zobel to come join us on the stage. Thank you again, gentlemen, for your presentations. And Colonel Lee, if you would help me do the honors of distributing gifts. All right, thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to our partners, to our combined staffs for making this event possible. We now invite you all to join us in the Great Hall for a reception. This concludes the formal portion of our program today.
So, hey, ladies and gentlemen, y'all have stayed until the end of the reception. This is the fun time. Please go up to these people, talk to them, ask more questions if you would like. Please take pictures. They're here for you. So let's enjoy our time together. Don't go away and go, oh, I wish I had gone and talked to so-and-so. This is your time to do it. So please, let's enjoy ourselves in the reception. Thank you.